Welcome to the Vintage Ballers Podcast. I'm your host, Brad Coreno. And on today's episode, we have MC Bravado joining the show. He is a rapper, MC, and educator out of New York who broke into the industry back in 2011 with his first album, Dope Perspective, and has worked with some of the biggest artists in hip hop. So without further ado, please welcome MC Bravado. Yeah, man, it's cool to have you on the show. I know you followed, my page for a while, and it's just, I appreciate what you stand for, obviously. And I know that you're my age. So I think you're a couple years younger than me. I'm 39. So, we grew up in that same era, and nothing better, man, than the 90s. I don't care if it was the music, the sports, the comedy, the shows, or whatever. I mean, the 90s, man, I'm telling you, like, it was just, maybe it's because we're sentimental, but there's something about that era for me that I just can't get over.
I agree. It was like the 60s were for, I think, like, my parents were just like the music, the athletes, like all of the things. But like, yeah, like I felt with 90s music, you could have something that was like a massive, like musically, you could have something that was like a hit, but that was also like super well written, super well performed. Like a lot of the gimmicky stuff and the not so well executed stuff that's like huge somehow today was like not a thing back then.
No.
So that's been an interesting landscape, like 20 years of doing what I do to like kind of adjust to that. But agreed with the basketball too, and the style and all of that, which I'm sure we'll get into.
Oh yeah. And I want to take it back to your youth too. But before we do that, I mean, yeah, the 90s in general for me, man, I just, even to this day, I just feel like, I don't know, again, it's probably because we were at a certain age then, and 10, 11, 12 years old, but like I look at Jordan and some of the things that came like back, Tupac or whatever you're thinking about in the 90s just seems iconic to me. Like the music itself, the sports. I don't care if it's comedy, whether it's Seinfeld, whatever it might be. There's just so many iconic things that came out in the 90s. It's like the 60s. You're right. It's like the Beatles or what have you. It's just a very iconic era. And and not to say there's not some great talent today. Obviously there is. I mean, you're one of them. But like today, to me, it's just a little bit different. It's so saturated today, and a lot of things are very commercial today, in my opinion. Like it's even some of I'll try to watch like a show on TV, Rich, like a comedy on TV, like a network TV, and I just can't get into a lot of it. I'm like, it's not like what it was back in the day, and I watch more HBO and that kind of stuff. But there is no Offices or Seinfeld anymore. There's no, and as far as musically, like I actually have found a ton of great music, but you have to kind of search for it sometimes. It's not always the the radio. Like back when we grew up, I mean, Biggie and Pac and those kind of guys were on the radio. I grew up in Cleveland, so we had Bone Thugs, and we had, I grew up listening to that stuff. And then of course all the rock music, and it was just like, it was the radio music to me was great. And it wasn't, now it's like it's a little more poppy and it's different today. And I can't wait to get your take on all that.
Oh, for sure, man. Yeah, Bone Thugs is amazing. I played with them once here in Baltimore.
Really?
Yeah, but they're so ahead of the curve in terms of a lot of these artists today try to do that melodic hip hop thing, and they were doing that 30 years ago. So I don't feel that Ohio really gets enough credit actually on the hip hop side. You don't have a lot of like kind of trailblazers, even in the underground scene. Guy like Copyright I've worked with, and recently doing some stuff with Jay Rawls, who's from Ohio and has worked with like Black Star and Beastie Boys, and like Ohio has a lot of really dope hip hop, and has over the years.
Well, and again, like getting back to Bone Thugs, back when we grew up in the early mid 90s here, obviously everyone listened to them just because they're Cleveland. Two of them were from Columbus, but the other two are from Cleveland, and they were, yeah. I mean, back then I think they were the only artist that I know of that worked with Eazy-E, Biggie, and Pac. All they had, yeah. They did. So I mean, they're pretty. Obviously, like you said, they were trendsetters, and the way they just the way they rapped, the way it was very melodic. You had 5 of them, and they all had their different styles. I mean, it was just, they were really incredible. And I still listen to them to this day. And, I've talked to Crazy every now and then, trying to get him on the podcast, but I have to go through his agent. It's a whole long story, but I talk to Crazy on my page every now and then. And we're both, big Browns fans and big Cleveland sports fans. So we talk about that every now and then, but I've never met him in person or, never anything like that. So I would love to get him or one of them on my show eventually, but yeah, just that Cleveland connection and the fact that they, back then, I mean, you have to remember we lost Easy, I think, in 95, and then Pac and Biggie in 96, 97. So it was like those 3 guys were, and those are all for the young listeners who are listening to this. I'm sure you know who they are, but they were truly truly iconic, rappers back in those days. And that was when rap was really starting to kind of come in the forefront in the 80s and 90s. It wasn't a thing before then. So that was really, our generation was the first to really embrace it at a young age, hip hop, rap, the 80s, 90s, and obviously you mentioned the Beastie Boys, one of my favorites of all time. And there's so many people back then we can talk about. We'll get into that later in the podcast because I want to pick your brain about some people. But take it back to your youth, Rich, and like growing up in White Plains. What was that like? And when did you fall in love with sports and music?
So I was born in White Plains, and then I predominantly came up in like Orange and Rockland County, which like Rockland County is like pretty close to the city, and then Orange County is a little further away, like an hour. Basketball really became like the first three-peat I was kind of aware of, but when I really got into playing and like becoming a Bulls diehard was when Jordan came back the first time. And that was also around that, like my first Bulls jersey was the 45. And I think my first pair of Jordans was like maybe the 9s. But my favorite pair of Jordans was the 11s, the Breds, black and red. And I remember cleaning them with Windex, like the patent leather, which made no sense, but like I didn't know any better. Because I was like so hardcore about those shoes. And like, I was a diehard Bulls fan from really 94, 95 on. I remember being like crushed when we lost to the Magic, and then like having this little, as a fifth grader, having like a chip on my shoulder about what was going to happen next. And boy, did it happen.
Oh, yeah.
And like hating Horace Grant, like just like
leaving and then
like,
beating you guys.
Yeah. And, he was like, to me, historically, has kind of become underrated because like everybody, especially a lot of these kids, when they talk about those Bulls teams, they always just, oh, well, they had Rodman. And you're like, no, for the first three-peat, they had this other guy who was like an all-star also and a better offensive player and was part of that Doberman defense. And like Horace Grant was a hell of a player and like in retrospect, I don't hate him and I really respect what he did,
I'll tell you what, it tells me you know your shit because Horace, I had Dennis Hobson on the program. He played in the 91 team. So the first Jordan team to win it all. And he was off their bench. He was a backup shooting guard. And, him and several other guys that played in that era always said that, like, first of all, that first three-peat team was really good. And no one understands that. You said they're kind of swept under the rug. Every time someone brings Chicago up, like you mentioned, it's always the Rodman era, which was great, obviously. But I've heard from several players who played against those teams that the 92 team was the best out of all of them, out of all six. Now, I don't know how, that's a debate that can go on for decades, but that's what I've been told, that the 92 team would have beaten the Rodman teams. Now, how true that is, we'll never know.
I mean, they won 67, I think. Then I've heard that argument. I believe it was Bill Simmons who thinks the 91 Bulls were the best Bulls team. But I mean, the difference, right? Like a hardcore difference besides Grant being kind of more of a two-way guy, was even more shooters between like I forget what year BJ's rookie year was, but they always had a second shooter to accompany Paxson, whether it was like Hodges or somebody else. Yep. So they had like Kerr was outstanding, but they had like two great shooters. The X factor, I guess, when you go second three-peat, you got a guy like Harper who, while he had lost some athletically, was still sacrificing a great deal to focus on, like he still could have gone somewhere else and gotten 17, 18, but he sacrificed for the greater good, and the triangle gave him another kind of tall, lanky disruptor. And then you had Kukoc, who was like, you look at the modern NBA, like Kukoc was a cheat code kind of doing it back then, could really play 1 through 4. Like that's why I kind of like, and then it comes down to whether you choose like athletic peak Jordan and Pippen versus like most cerebral, locked in Yoda-esque versions. Like, which one do you like better? I slightly edge 95, 96 just because they were like nothing. They wanted to kill everyone, and they did. So.
Well, I think you make some great points there, and a lot of people would say the later Bulls, who not players but the fans would say the later Bulls, and I still have a debate in my head about it because, like you said, Kukoc. I mean, you put Kukoc, that death lineup with Kukoc and Harper with the big three. That's hard to beat. I mean, that's hard. They're all like 6'7" to 6'11", 6'10". They all can defend. They all can play. I mean, they could, Rodman wasn't great offensively, but he could do, I mean, he was so brilliant in other aspects of the game. And then, like you said, Jordan and Pippen were more cerebral then. Jordan really, I mean, he obviously lost a little bit of his athleticism, but he was so, I mean, it's MJ. He was so dynamic and so intelligent and knew when the pump fake, I mean, he knew every spot to be, and he was still athletic. Obviously, we're still talking about Jordan, but he wasn't what he was in 92, 93 necessarily. But I just think those later 90s Bulls were, they weren't as, I don't know. I just, it's hard for me to see them losing to anybody and when they're all healthy, just the way they played. And there was always that debate. I'm sure you've heard this a million times. The Warriors, the Durant Warriors versus the 96 Bulls. I've asked a lot of players who are on this podcast, several players who play with Kobe, MJ, and they all kind of give a similar answer, Rich. They say it depends what rules you're playing in, the 90s era or the today. If it's 90s, they give it the advantage to MJ. They go, ain't nobody beating MJ, Scotty. And, when you can hand check and bump people and it's a little more physical. But they said, if today's rules where you can't touch people as much, coming around picks and Steph and Clay are coming around, and they think the Warriors might have won, depending on the rules. I've heard that from probably 4 or 5 different players. So what is your take on that?
See, I think that's interesting because like the inverse of that is if you can't be physical with Jordan, like what the hell are you going to do?
That's true. That's very true. He'll put up 50.
I really like if Harden could do what he did, you got to think in terms of drawing the fouls, just like every single time. It's interesting. I think it's a lot closer. Obviously, I'm biased, but like, I think if you're going today's rules, I'd say it'd be 7 for Chicago as opposed to 6 in the old rules. I think like either way, it's tightly contested. Those Warriors teams are phenomenal. Like, I don't think it's an easy pick either way. All of them have historically great guys, but like, you talked about the one death lineup, and then you think about another one where Scotty's running point, Mike's at the 2. You know what I mean? You've got Rodman, you've got Kukoc. Like, there's just even bringing in Curry in as a shooter. Like, they just had too much. Like, I don't know. I think the Bulls had too much, sauce, so to speak, and just killer instincts. I know that's not a tangible thing, but I think their highest level was different. And take it to like 98 with Jordan, right? Like in that second half against Utah in game 6, like Scotty's a decoy, and he's basically beating the Jazz by himself on their home court.
Yep.
Aside from the famous last sequence where it's like encapsulates everything he does well into gets to the cup, steals the ball, hits the mid-range. Like, aside from that, which in my opinion is the most fantastic sequence in the history of sports,
agree.
You got to look like people will be like, oh, he shot X, Y, or Z, or his assist numbers. It's like, dude, they were, as a kid, I would be nervous. I was in 7th grade at the time, but you kind of know the Bulls got it, right? You're like, they're going to figure it out. But looking at it now, it's a miracle that they did, because they were running on total fumes at that point. And you got to think if it goes 7, they lose.
I think they definitely lose in 7. I don't see them, not with that Jazz crowd. And like you said, Pippen was hurt. And if he can't play, I mean, for one game, Jordan get away with that because it's Jordan, but they have to do it another game and carry them again. Now, Jordan could have done it, but he would have to put up 45 or 50 likely, to beat that team, because without Pippen, that would have been a real, especially if Stockton or Malone went off. So I don't know. I mean, that would have been, I think you're right. I don't know if they would have won that if Jordan doesn't take care of business in game 6.
Grueling. Grueling. And they should have won it in 5. That was uncharacteristic that they kind of took their foot off the gas, because they kind of demoralized them before that, blew them out. And then like they should have closed it in 5. You actually saw that the same year before 96 with Seattle, when they should have beat Seattle in 5 and they didn't close them out. But kind of uncharacteristic, almost playing with their food kind of thing. But man, that was like, and that year in general was grueling. I mean, Indiana, that was the best Pacers team, period, I think. And that series, watching it back, really shouldn't have gone 7. The Bulls lost a few really tough games by a couple points, and their margin of victory was much higher. But like, the one that stands out obviously is the one that rimmed. Jordan had that probably would have been the most legendary shot of his career, the double clutch 3 that just rimmed out when Reggie hits the shot and Bird, he's going crazy, and Bird is just looking at the shot clock, not saying 0.8. Like, I know who's on the other end. And sure enough, like great, oh, that was so close to
Oh,
going in. That
well, and
was
that's
nuts.
those series back then. I'm glad you brought up Indiana. The Pacers Bulls never would get as much credit. I mean, you always hear Pacers, or I'm sorry, the Bulls Knicks obviously get a lot, and then those Bulls Jazz finals. But Bulls Pacers that 98 series was fantastic, and Reggie hitting the shot, and I mean you had two guys. Reggie Miller does not get enough credit for how he was truly one of the most clutch players in NBA history, and it's not even
For sure.
close. And I mean he was kind of a mix of Steph and Clay before Steph and Clay, and just clutch, could hit from 35 feet away. He could hit miraculous shots. He can do it with the shot clock winding down. I mean, whatever it came coming off pick, standing still, didn't matter. Reggie was Reggie. And I think that Pacers team, I mean, they're Mark Jackson and, Dill Davis, Antonio Davis, all those guys, Smiths, obviously. I mean, you had that was a team. That was them, Jalen Rose. So they give the Bulls all they can handle. And the Bulls, I mean, like you said, sure, the Bulls, I think probably, maybe could have taken them down to 5 or 6, but that series was one of the more interesting series I think the Bulls faced in all those years of winning those championships. We talk about those Knicks series back in the early 90s, but I think that 98 series I mean, Indiana had them on the ropes in game 7. And then of course, Chicago pulled away, but that could have went either way at the end.
That was a absolutely insane series. And the Pacers kind of get lost in the mix when people are kind of talking about like waxing poetic about the 90s, like in the East. Like Indiana was right there, like year after year after year. And it's funny, man, because I gauge how good other players were in that era based on who kind of struck fear in me at that age. And Indiana on the Jazz, the person that struck the most fear in me was Stockton. On the Knicks, it was Ewing. And on the Pacers, it was both Miller and Smits, because when he got it going, like 7'4", I think he was, he had like the touch he had around the basket and the mid, like he was a problem. He was a load to contain. And he went to Marist, where my brother actually went to Marist that's not too far from where we grew up in Poughkeepsie, New York. It's not like that far, but he went to school there and is like one of their best, probably their best player that ever passed through there. But yeah, Indiana is one of those teams that I'm like, they should have got one. They probably should have got one. But
I always was kind of, sad for guys like Reggie who never got one, because he was such a great player. And I mean, because of MJ, because your boy, I mean, Carl, John Stockton, Patrick Ewing, Reggie Miller, Charles Barkley, none of those guys got one because of MJ. I mean, if you don't have MJ in that era, they likely all at least 3 of those guys get one, I would think. But MJ was that guy. You just weren't going to beat him.
I mean, Cleveland too, right? Like early.
Don't get me started.
I'm sorry. I was good in a complimentary way. I mean, you guys were like stacked, like talent wise. You guys had a phenomenal team, and Mark Price is another one of those guys that I don't think a lot of people realize how good Harper was when he was young, how good Brad Daugherty was, and how good like Mark Price was, because
Larry
Mark
Nance.
Price.
Yep.
Yeah, Larry Nance. That's right. You guys were tough, man.
Yep.
You guys
Rod Williams, a very good team. Craig Elo. They were Terrell Brandon was a backup point guard on that team. I mean, they had a lot of talent. And again, MJ, we couldn't get past him. I mean, I think we lost him 3 or 4 times in the playoffs, and we just could not. I mean, you guys just destroyed us. We could not beat Chicago. And it was anybody else, I think if you stack the Cavs up, another team like Indiana, I mean, they were right there a lot of those years, but we just could not. I think we ended Larry Bird's career. We were the last team to beat him in the playoffs in '92. We beat, I remember Drazen Petrovic and those Nets team with Derek Coleman. I actually had Kenny Anderson on the podcast. Great guy. So, we beat that team, and then we beat the Celtics, and then we came up against you guys, and I think we got swept or lost 4-1, whatever it was. And I was like in 3rd or 4th grade then. And I remember everybody here is like, yeah, we're not, Chicago. I mean, what are you going to do about it? It's like going against Babe Ruth.
You got us back later though. You got us back later.
We got another number 23 that finally, that came back for the second time. And I'll tell you what, that was here in Cleveland, like, because we have a very interesting relationship with LeBron because he grew up here, obviously. So it was like our son, it was like someone who grew up in your backyard. And obviously when he first was drafted, it was everything was perfect. And we got to the finals for the first time. Then he leaves, and it was pretty ugly for 4 years. And then he comes back, and it was kind of funny because everyone completely just changed their mind about it. Like everyone was so angry at him and was so mad. And then they softened a little bit as time went on. And then when he came back, I mean, people just went crazy. And of course, winning that championship here, no one here will ever forget that. And, LeBron now, obviously they give him standing ovations every time he comes back, but it's cool how it all turned out. We got our championship finally. And, LeBron I think that was a defining moment of his career, obviously, is winning one here and snapping the 50-year streak of Cleveland sports. So it was good for everybody. But the Jordan years, whenever I have an interesting relationship with MJ and LeBron, just because I grew up watching MJ beat my Cavs over and over again. And then I got to see LeBron win one here for us. So I always, whenever someone asks me running this page, like, well, who do you think's better? I mean, of course, like I grew up with MJ, so I mean, he's the greatest competitor I've ever seen. But LeBron's a hell of a player. I mean, I'm never going to put down LeBron. He was a hell of a player. He still is. I mean, he's going to break the all-time record, scoring record, and I'll take him or MJ any day, all day long, and I'd be just fine. That's my answer to that.
It is a which direction I go, but
Oh, I know.
It is close. It is like turning almost into a 1A 1B type situation. My favorite version of LeBron would be, I think the one that won you guys won is like right there, but that freaking Miami version at the end there, like
He was a beast.
Peak of powers, like defensively, is just terrifying. It almost like this Vader, like dude in the black, and like, yeah, those teams with Rose, obviously, that was heartbreaking for me the year that he tore it, because that would have been quite the showdown that year. Like, I think we were all robbed of, because I think that was the best Bulls team. They would have had home court. Like, that would have been a war. But I think realistically, like, I have my long argument for Jordan, but for me, I think non-biased me recognizes, at least, I think you can make an argument for three guys, and I think it's Jordan, Kareem, and LeBron. Like, you can argue for each of them, and not be wrong. You know what I mean? You can't, like, you can have your opinion, but like, I don't like when people, and I have a strong one, but I don't like when people try to say like, oh, you're wrong, or this is so far off. Like, when you're talking about people like that, I even think I was doing an all-time starting five in any era. Like, if you could pick up that starting five and place it at any time, like, which five would you run with? And I actually had Hakeem as my center, because he would fare so well today with his mobility and, like, his ability to switch on defense and little things like that. And people were like trying to fight me on that one. And I'm like, that dude, like, kind of gets lost in the sauce too. I mean, he's a top 10 player in my opinion.
So I'm glad it's so funny you bring him up, Rich, because he's my favorite player of all time. So even ahead of LeBron. I mean, I love LeBron, obviously. Don't get me wrong, because what he did here, but Hakeem is my favorite athlete of all time. And I idolized him when I was a kid, even though I was never a Rockets fan because I was a Cavs fan, but they're like my second favorite team after the Cavs. Just, I love that. And I've actually talked to Robert Horry about it on my page, and I've had Pete Chilcutt in the podcast, and several of those Rockets follow the page. I've talked to Vernon Maxwell and Pete on my podcast, who played with him in the 95 championship team with Clyde Drexler, said Brad, his footwork was, I mean, he was like a point guard in almost a 7-footer's body. And what he did, David Robinson, he's like, I'm playing on the court with him, watching him just destroy the defensive player of the year. I mean, David Robinson was a hell of a player, one of the greatest players of all time. And sure, he made him look bad. And then he made Shaq look really bad in the finals. And I mean, I know Shaq was younger, but even Shaq will tell you, yeah, I wasn't ready to face Dream, man. I mean, Dream, he got his on Dream, but he couldn't stop Dream. And, if Shaq can't stop you at his size, and if David Robinson in his prime can't stop you, nobody's stopping you in NBA history. So I think you're 100% right. In this era, like you said, he's agile. He can run. He could hit threes. People forget Hakeem could hit threes, and he wasn't even taking many of them. So imagine if in this era, if he would have been practicing hitting his 3-point shot. I mean, you're talking about a more athletic, more skilled Embiid. What you're talking about. He's not as big, but he's more athletic and more skilled. I mean, that's a scary player.
And would move, better mobility and stuff. I definitely, like, I would go, my five was any era, pick up and go. And who I have at the power forward might surprise you a little bit, maybe not too much, but I would run out Hakeem. I would run out Rodman, like Detroit version. I'd run out LeBron, Jordan, and Curry. And I think with 2 through 5, as many phenomenal defenders as you have, like, that would mitigate whatever Steph wasn't bringing defensively. You got the greatest shooter of all time. You've got the greatest scorer. You got the queen on the chessboard. You have Hakeem, and you have a guy who doesn't need the ball to dominate and could guard 1 through 5 efficiently in his Detroit heyday. And underrated passer, underrated at cutting to the basket. Like, will give you however many rebounds. Like, I think that team, pick them up, put them anywhere, would be really tough. regardless of the era.
I,
That's my favorite five.
that might be the best, the most interesting, because I actually your starting five is exactly like mine, except for one person. I'll tell you who that is in a second. But that like Curry, for example. I mean, I know a lot of the old school guys say, "Oh, you know, he wouldn't last." You know, I'm telling you, with his
He
shooting,
would.
you could put him in any era. When you can shoot from 40 feet away consistently and hit him, you can play in any era. I'm sorry. I mean that he's just. We had to face him in the finals in Cleveland here 4 times. I saw what he's all about. I mean, I don't have to see any more. Kid's incredible, and anytime you can, and he's gotten better as he's gotten older. He hasn't. Last year in the finals, he showed me something. I mean, he carried them to that championship, and say what you want, the kid's unreal, and he's the great, by far the greatest shooter of all time. I don't care what anybody says. And again, this is coming from a guy who loves the 90s and loves, you know, Reggie and Drazen Petrovic and all those great shooters back then. But and all those guys will tell you this is the greatest shooter. You know, I mean, you know, Reggie and those guys now will tell you that he is the greatest shooter of all time. It's not even close. So
100%.
and then Clay, you got to put Clay up there. He's a top 5, top 10 shooter of all time. He's unbelievable. So you have two, arguably the top 4 or 5 shooters of all time on one backcourt. Yeah, so Steph, you can never go wrong with Steph. And I know defensively he's more of a liability. He's a little smaller, but like you said, you're making up for that with Rodman and Akeem and LeBron and Jordan. And those are 4 in their primes. Those are 4 of the top 10 defensive players of all time. So I don't think you have any problem defensively. And for me, my starting five, I thought about this before, and I flipped Magic and Curry in recent years because Curry's just so I can't not have Curry in there. So my other one is probably a surprise to a lot of people. I used to have Tim Duncan, but now I have Dirk. I'll tell you why. Because I think when you put Dirk in any area, and I know he's not a great defensive player, but with his shooting ability, and you have MJ and LeBron there with Steph and Dirk, and then you have Akeem, offensively, how do you guard that?
No,
I mean,
you can't.
You can't. I mean, I know he's not as now. They're not going to be as good defensively as your team because you have Rodman, but offensively, I mean, I don't see any team in NBA history that can roll with them on a nightly basis. You know, with Dirk and Steph, and how good that, you know, just the outside shot, and then of course Dream could do everything, and then MJ and LeBron. I mean, pick your poison, but have fun with that one.
Yeah, that I love Dirk, man. I think Dirk is also like one of my on my laundry list of guys that, I mean, he's properly rated for a lot of people that are a little younger, but I think sometimes people even in our age range sleep on how special he was. And he was tough too. He was tough, so he could have played whenever and been a hell of a player. You know, I'm a big Dirk fan.
And Rich, his finals run 11. He beat Brandon Roy and Marcus Aldridge first round. Then he beat Kobe and Gasol second round. And then he beat Durant, Harden, Westbrook third round. And then he beat LeBron, Wade, and Bosh in the final. That's unbelievable. Look, I mean, I don't know if anybody's done something like that. And that's just, I mean, Dream had a pretty good run. I know the Jazz actually didn't win the championship. I think 98 beat like Kobe and Shaq and Duncan and Robinson. They had a pretty impressive run until they lost to MJ. But that run in 2011, and Dirk didn't have any superstar next to him. It was Dirk. I mean, Jason Terry, no disrespect. Jason Kidd was much older. Marion was older. They didn't have guys in their prime necessarily, except for him. And, you know, that was a heck of a run. I mean, he pretty much carried that team to a championship.
Yeah, Dirk is special. And obviously I was like rooting for you know, the Mavs that year.
That year, I definitely, if I would have known LeBron was coming back, I wouldn't have been as mad. But at that year, I was definitely a Mavericks fan.
Yeah, I mean, he's part of it's weird because like when we were, you know, younger and you talk 90s basketball, it was like, remember, like it was always this caution around like the Euro guys, right? And now it's like if they're good, they're good. Everyone knows. I don't think you're gonna get even some of the mistakes GMs made with Jokic as a second round pick or Luka being to this or to that. Like those who know the game the best at the time were looking at Luka and being like, how would you not take this guy number one?
Seriously.
Like, just
what are you doing?
Killing grown men like already, like in the second best league. Like this is a prodigy right in front of your face. Like, sure, Aiton might be, you know, become a very diet David Robinson, but like, because that's David Robinson, another guy, if you plugged him in today in his prime, would absolutely murder.
Absolutely.
You know, but that's with Aiton, that's why I was kind of like high on him and hopeful. I'm like, I see some, you know, but obviously he's not that. He's still got a lot of runway ahead of him, but like he's got to get, I think that trade has to happen. He needs a change of scenery or something.
I agree with you 100%. And another guy is Ginobili. You know, Ginobili and Parker, a couple of European guys that people slept on. I mean, they were barely even known back then. And Ginobili was like the 59th pick, whatever he was. And obviously it's Ginobili. So the Spurs, you got to give them credit. Popovich and those guys over there putting, you know, obviously it ran around Tim, but and Greg, but defining Parker and Ginobili, I mean, they fit perfectly with Duncan and the way they could. I mean, they just that team in 2014 that beat LeBron and they destroyed the Heat in the finals before he came
Oh,
back
they
to
killed.
Cleveland. LeBron said that was the greatest team I ever played against. Like we couldn't do anything. I mean, they had Boris Diaw. I think they had Kawhi, obviously, and I mean, they just absolutely annihilated them. I mean, I think some of the games are like 30-point blowouts. I mean, this is the Heat with Boshway and LeBron, and they're just annihilating them. It wasn't even close.
It was like that was like the ball movement, of course, the take it back Euro. It was almost like the most fine-tuned like Champions League team where it was every extra pass and like the ball was not sticking like ever, and everybody bought in. One of the greatest coaches ever, one of the greatest players ever, an emerging greatest, superstar in Kawhi, like all of the and guys who could have been better on other teams or had gaudier stats on other teams, all buying in, a motive and revenge on the mind. Like they checked every box of like a historically tough out, because they should have beat them prior too. But
They should have. You're right.
yeah, that team was unbelievable as well for
They're
sure.
unbelievable. Like you said, I don't think Richard was a bad pass. You could watch a whole quarter of that series and not see a bad pass from San Antonio. I mean, they were so on point. They knew when to cut, when not to cut, when to back pick. I mean, everything they did was just perfect. I watched them and I'm like, how? I mean, after the first quarter, it would be like 30-12. They would just be destroying. I mean, it wasn't even close. And you're thinking how? And you see LeBron was going off for like 40 points, and they were still losing by 20 or 30. I mean, it was unbelievable. I've never. And LeBron, you can tell at the end of the series, he's like, what are we going to do? Like, how are we going to stop that?
I think the league is like really praying that they don't get a shot at Wemby, because if they do, Pop's gonna find some more time in the tank. Something tells me to stick
Oh
around.
yeah, I'll tell you, Wemby. I'm curious to see what he's going to be like. I mean, obviously he's just, I mean, he's a prodigy, but with his size, that's the only thing that scares me about him is will he stay healthy? That's hard. I mean, what is he 7'2", 7? That's like, I mean, even the guys like Durant, the bigger, skinnier guys tend to, there's injury potential there. Now, Giannis bulked up a little bit, and obviously he's just a freak of nature. But will Wemby, we'll see. Talent-wise, he's going to be an all-timer. That's a no-brainer. But will he be? Because Luka has some muscle on him. He's not as athletic, but Luka has some bulk. That's the only thing that scares me about this kid is that something happens. Is he going to be injured a lot? Is he, because you watch Durant, he has like a Durant-like body to me, where he's just freaky athleticism, but like a little skinny, and it's like. And Durant's hurt like every year now. I feel he's out like a couple months almost every year, and it's cost him a couple playoff runs. So will that be the same with Wemby, or I don't know. But the big men, look at Embiid. I mean, you can go down the list of guys who are big and have suffered injuries, but that's my only concern with him. Everything else seems like he's a 10 out of 10, maybe a 13 out of 10 home run. And the kid is just, I've never seen any prodigy like him. LeBron may be close in a different way. But as far as just like his size and his athleticism, and I mean, 7'2", and he can hit threes and doing bank, 1 foot or one, high step threes at 27 feet away. I'm like, what is this guy doing? Just disgusting.
It's he's a creative player, and it's like, as prospect wise, it's like you're talking LeBron, Shaq, Kareem, like very short list of like guys who are coming in like looking like that, and you got to figure. But I feel you on the injury concern, because look at like Chet Holmgren, right? Like he didn't even get any burn. And now, granted, he's not quite that like brittle, but it's very valid. That's what. But you still got to swing for the fences and try to get like, as a Bulls fan, I was like, do we blow it up? Like, I don't know. I say no now because they kind of, we're going to just be mediocre, which is unfortunate, but I wouldn't have it in me to blow it up. But I would understand why like most teams would, just to have any kind of chance at a talent like this. Cause this is if he stays on the court, this is a historical franchise changing once in a generation kind of guy. So, and you can't overthink it,
No, you're right. And you can't, like, I think with him, Rich, whoever gets him is winning at least 2 or 3 championships. I mean, at least, and depending on injury history and who they get around him. But I would think with a guy that talented, I mean, look at some of the greatest talents of all time, the Kobe's and LeBrons and Jordans, they all get at least 3 or 4 at least. And, so you got to think this kid, I mean, Durant, I know Durant went to the Warriors, but still most of those guys will get at least a few. And I think this kid could get 3 or 4, if not 5 or 6, depending on who they have around him.
Yeah, and he's got an opportunity to fall into some interesting situations. Like, obviously, San Antonio speaks for itself with the system and the culture, but like potentially OKC, potentially like Houston, where there's some super intriguing pieces already. Like, most of the outcomes for him look like they'd be good situations for him to grow and kind of thrive in. But speaking of like the multiple championships thing, as a Magic fan, that had to be 96 that summer, Shaq. Like, how do you even play with those negotiations? Like, and because that's what led to him walking. Like, he was young and like brash, but he needed to be told the right things, and they played with him, and he took off. Like, that was classic, like apex Jerry West, obviously, to add Shaq and Kobe in one offseason.
I mean, think about
Insane.
that. I mean, and just the fact that, like you said, the fact that Kobe's coming out that year and you added him via trade, you'll never see an offseason like that again. I mean, add two players like that. Even LeBron and Bosh wasn't Shaq and Kobe. That Shaq and Kobe, and that's a pretty that's that's an insane. I mean, I don't think we'll ever see any offseason like that. I mean, I know the Kawhi and Paul George went to the Clippers, and we've seen a couple of pretty cool ones, but I mean, that's iconic right there. And you get those guys within what, a month of each other. I mean, that's just insane. And like you said, how could the Magic let I'll never understand that. Like, why would you even toy with Shaq? I mean, you're talking about the most dominant, physically dominant player we've probably ever seen, maybe in sports history, at least one of them in sports history.
For
And you're
sure.
going to let him just walk in when he's 20, 25 or 20, whatever he was, 26. It's like, what are you doing? I just, to this day, I'll never understand that. To nickel and dime him, it's like, just give him the money.
You got to think too. Like, I'm saying this with all of my honesty. Like, they wouldn't beat the Bulls in '97, but you you wonder in '98, slightly different fortunes. Like, if you have a healthy Penny and shit, you wonder like that would have been quite the test, and we'll never know.
Well, let me ask you this. If Penny stays healthy and Shaq stays in Orlando, how many championships do they win?
Shoo, as a duo,
And you can add like Horace to that for a couple years, obviously. Now I agree with you. I don't think they beat Chicago in 97. But after that, it's I think it's kind of wide open. If they could beat him in 98, it's wide open for a couple years, just like it was for Kobe and Shaq.
yeah, you've got the Spurs kind of right there on the other side. I give
You do.
them, and Penny, as great as he was, I don't think he's top 10 like Kobe. Uh, I give him three.
Yeah, I would say two or three. That's exactly what
Yeah,
I would say. Yeah, I mean,
yeah.
and people kind of sleep on that what that could have been. And I know I posted about that on my page before, and people say, well, we already saw that with Kobe and Shaq. I'm like, well, yeah, you did, but I mean, Penny and Shaq, it would have been a little bit different in some ways because Penny was a point guard. So you said he's not top 10 like Kobe. Kobe's an all timer, but Penny could have been if he stayed healthy. As far as I mean, he was the closest thing I saw to like a Magic 6'7" point guard, and who could score 25 a game. I mean, he wasn't Magic, but he was pretty darn good. And he was a good
His
defender too.
he was his vision and like, yeah, he was fun, man. He was electric to watch. Just like you said, he could fill it up, he could defend, and then like some of the passes he made were just stupid. And like there was a panache to him, and like, with that Magic team, and they were cocky and they had every right to be. I mean, they're to be that good, that young. I'm not gonna lie to you, with his as arrogant as Nick Anderson was after the steal, kind of didn't hate to watch him choke at the line after that. I mean,
Four
did I?
misses.
Yeah, I don't hate. I don't like that the guy was never the same after that. I wouldn't wish that on anyone. But like when he stole the ball from Jordan and he was acting like the coronation had already happened, and it's like you still got to go through. You got work to do still. And there were some instances there where you wonder like if they were, not saying Brian Hill like is a terrible coach, but you wonder if it's a different regime and it's a little bit of a tighter, more of a disciplinarian in there. You wonder how even that year would have shaken out. I don't know.
Yeah. And even
But
if those free throws, like you mentioned, like if he hits those free throws, is that series different? I mean, we'll never know. But I mean, that was it. Once he missed those and they lost that game, that was it. They weren't gonna. That was just too much to overcome. Because I mean, once you went back to Houston, they weren't losing there. But yeah, that whole Magic team, Dennis Scott. I mean, they had guys like Donald Royal. I mean, they had a nice squad there. Jeff Turner off the bench, who's a nice shooter. I mean, they got some players, and of course Horace, and we know the rest of the story. But like I feel they get at least a couple championships if Penny stays healthy and Shaq stays. I don't think there's any question they get a couple. Do they beat the Bulls multiple times? No, but they could beat them once.
it
In
could have been
'98, especially if Scotty was a little banged up, or I mean, yeah, they could beat them, but it would have been a great series. I don't think they would have gotten swept like they did in '96. That's for sure. But who knows?
I agree. I agree. That's a great one. If I know we were talking on the page about the one of my favorites is that Finley what if, like if the Bulls got to start retooling on the fly, like does Mike like look at that and say like, okay, 98, 99, maybe, like shortened season. Do they think about it? I, it's fun. It's fun to
I mean,
think about. That
if
would have
you
been a hell of a series too.
if he was on the team, Rich, I would. Why wouldn't you come back for 1 year? Just I mean, yeah, I would. You have a young gun now, and you still got Scotty, who's still pretty darn good. Still got Tony in his prime. You got Steve. I would have. One more year, and there was a shortened season. The Spurs, they could have beaten the Spurs. I mean, Duncan Robinson were great, but I mean, you're talking about MJ. So, and then Michael Finley to that. Yeah, I think that would have extended. I think they get possibly one more.
I agree, which would have been nuts. And I always wonder, like, you always wonder how many in a row they would have gotten. I think the Houston one, like, they probably get one of two from them. I don't think they beat Hakeem both times,
I agree.
uh, but I think they probably beat him one. I think it's probably they split in that
Well,
scenario.
and do you
But
ever? A lot of people I feel don't understand because I hear a lot of people on my page always say, "Oh, they would have won 8 straight." I don't think people understand like how crazy that. Like that's not. You have to think injuries, and I mean 8. Part of the reason why I think they won the second three-peat is because Jordan had that year off. I know he's playing baseball, but I mean, he wasn't, he rested his body a little bit. He was just, I think he needed that mental break from his father passing away. So to me, that's part of the reason he came back. And of course, 95, he was still, he wasn't himself yet. But I don't know. I mean, 8 straight. I don't know if anybody, I mean, I don't think people understand how hard that would be to do. So, and nothing against MJ. I mean, I'm not saying that I would pick him to lose, but like you said, I think Dream beats him once in that stretch in those 2 years, especially when they were rolling. I mean, the Rockets had a squad, man. You have Mario Ellie and Ori and Kenny Smith and Vernon Maxwell and Clyde. I mean, they had a heck of a squad. So
they did.
and they could all shoot. And that's the one thing, the biggest kryptonite with Chicago, it was how could they guard Dream? Obviously, they couldn't guard. They never really faced a great center in the finals because all the teams they faced never had a great center. So you put Dream there, and then you put all those shooters around him who are all clutch. I don't know. I mean, it would have won 7 likely, but I got to think Dream would have got one of those.
I agree. Yeah, they probably split, and I think like you're saying, whether it was him retired or not, they needed to kind of press like a refresh button on it and rebuild on the fly, like like they did, because that second three-peat was a different unit. You know what I mean? I mean, there was the core, but the way they played changed. The biggest difference, obviously, being Tony, and then we talked about the guys getting more cerebral, but then even like your Harper, who's a more like triangle friendly, we're going to use you to defend and help run the triangle kind of guy. Like it was a different team, but they needed that change to continue their dominance and to continue to win. So if he never retires, do they extend the first one too long? Like with the same, there's too many what ifs. And yeah, with somebody as good as Olajuwon, and like you said, those shooters, it's tough for me to think, even as a big fan, that they would have definitely gone 2 for 2. I think they'd have lost probably the first one, and then they probably would have beat him in '95. Would be my guess. I think they would have won the second one.
Yeah, I agree with you on that.
But that I love, man. I wish we could know for sure.
I know. Wouldn't you love to see? That's like, if there's a heaven, I hope they have old. I hope we could go relive like series in our mind because I would love to see some of these series. Another series I always thought about. I know this is kind of maybe a little bit off because of the ages they would have been. But the 2000, if the Bulls would have stayed around 2 more years into 2000 and played Kobe and Shaq in the finals, if they had Michael Finley, let's say, what would that? I mean, could they? I mean, I can't imagine they wouldn't have given a good series. I mean, how could have? And I know Kobe and Shaq was so dominant they wouldn't have been able to stop Shaq. But if MJ was still MJ, I mean, and then you had Scott. I don't know. That would have been a fascinating series.
One thing I think I agree with you, and one thing I think the Bulls a minor miscue on their part is in 96, 97, one of the big differences between the two teams is on that playoff run, they had Brian Williams, Bison Dele, who was out of all their centers, to me, like obviously he had his issues, but like when he was locked in, it was pretty damn good. It was like the most talented big like that I'd seen with them. And you wonder, like, they kept him around, and then you got a Finley, you've got a center who's a little more hypothetically, if he's locked in and like giving you more at that spot. Yeah, that would have been, a hell of a series. I mean, by then, because Jordan came back like after in the Wizards years, people forget like a couple key things about that. They forget about the injury to the finger. on, the cigar cutter, that whole situation. And then they forget that when he was coming back, the rib injury, from our test, kind of set him back quite a bit in his progress. And he still did what he did on Washington, which is underrated in terms of like, the fact that he still scored the ball the way that he did at that age and as limited as he was. You have to think 99, 2000, he's in better shape still. And, they're retooling a bit. They could have given him a run. I think Shaq at that point was just too much, but I think it's probably a 7-game series, Um, Shaq at then was like those 3 years was just,
No,
as dominant as anybody you've ever seen. So
he was disgusting. But I mean, you got to think the Pacers took him to 6, and no disrespect to Indiana, but they were a little bit older. Reggie was older and Rick was older. So you got to think MJ and those guys. I mean, would they have beaten him? Probably not, because like you said, Shaq is so, and Kobe was coming into his own. They were so good, but that would have been a very intriguing series, especially if they had a Finley and Bison Dele at that time. That would have been really interesting. And Bison, Brian Williams, the late Brian Williams, like it's sad to see how his life obviously ended. And he was a very underrated player in the whole era, because those Nuggets teams of the mid '90s with Dikembe and Alfonso Ellis and those guys that upset the Sonics in the first round. They had so many guys that went on to have nice careers in different places, and it's a shame that I always wonder what that team would have been like if they could have kept them together. Along Robert Pack was on that team, and of course, Chris Jackson, and they had so many great players in that team that end up having nice careers.
I agree with you entirely. And I think, well, that Bulls Lakers, I would put it like 60-40 kind of odds. I don't think like you're obviously not shocked if Chicago wins,
Nope.
but I agree with you with Bison Daly and with Chris Jackson. I think something that people don't speak about enough, right? You got guys today like Westbrook who do what they do, like fashion and personality wise, right? And like Rodman was like an exception in that era where the league, would suspend them and would do the, things to him, and he'd be disciplined. But he's a top 2 to 3 defender and rebounder both. So when a guy's that good, there's like nothing like league climate doesn't matter. But I think with guys like Chris Jackson and Bison Daly, I think if they were placed in a more liberal like league climate where like their expression and the things they were going to were less taboo than they were at that time, you may have seen a crazier longevity and a more prolific career out of both of those. I mean, Chris Jackson as a scorer, Abdul Rauf, like, I mean, unfreaking believable. Like, he's
Unbelievable.
another guy today would have absolutely cleaned up.
Unbelievable. No, you're 100% right on that. And I think you're right. I never thought about how the off the court stuff affected those guys' careers. I mean, it did. There's no question about it. And it's a shame it did turn out like that. Cause I think, there was all that stuff went down around 96 with Chris Jackson and, and of course, Bison later on, he, his brother, whatever happened with him and his brother, the whole thing was so weird out in the boat. But no, like I think having their off the court stuff, there's no question it affected their playing. And I think the trajectory of what they would have, like in today's era with Chris Jackson, I mean, there's no question he would have, I mean, he was the epitome of a point guard you want today. Just like you mentioned Mark Price earlier, those kind of guys who really get overlooked in that era, which is a shame, would have been absolutely dynamic in today's era. How are you going to stop? I mean, Jackson, he was quick. He had one of the quickest releases of any, guard in league history. He can shoot for, range like Steph could. I mean, he was a heck of a player, and it's a shame that he never really gets highlighted. I mean, you never really hear about him at all. And one of those players that just gets lost in the shuffle.
He does, man. And I think what also weighs into these decisions is like not playing playing in a smaller market for a franchise that's not as glamorous. They probably look the other way more if he's a Bull or if he's a Laker, or, and all of these things are factors. And he's such a talented player. I mean, he's still like playing even in the big three, up until recently, if not still. I mean, the guy's still killing people in the half court, like he's that gifted offensively. He's literally gray all the way. Yeah. And still like can get a bucket on you. I mean, that guy was absolutely tremendous scorer. And yeah, I really fun NBA Jam team.
Oh yeah, definitely a fun NBA Jam team. Rodney Rogers, another guy. Give a shout out to Rodney, and they had a fun. That was a great team, and to think that Chris Jackson and Shaq were at LSU together, and Stanley Roberts. But I mean, think about that? If those guys would actually click there, I mean, jeez, how do you stop that? in
Yeah, that
college?
would. Yeah, that would. It's. I guess that's part of Shaq's. It's not any against him on his resume because his college coach, I believe, was like, "Go,"
It
when it was
was
time
Dale
to
Brown.
go.
Yep.
But that's one thing. It would have been fun to see Shaq have a deep NCAA run. You know what I mean? That would have been. And also, Shaq should have been on the dream team.
Oh,
Uh,
I mean, hindsight at the time, I get it because Leitner was the best player at that time in college
he was.
basketball. But looking back now, yeah, I mean, obviously it's a no brainer with Shaq. So no disrespect to Christian, but at the time he earned it and they did his thing, and But I mean, back in those days, my brother was a good college basketball player, a good basketball player in general. He played for an NAI college, but he got to play against a Fab Five in a tournament, and so we grew up in Ohio, and they were all up in Michigan. So he played against them, I think, in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and he was saying how Chris Webber, he's like, man, I mean, just to go back to that era of college basketball, how great it was. He's like, Webber, he scored 24 off Webber. Webber scored 44 off him. And my brother was a heck of a defender. And he's like, yeah, he was unbelievable. And then you had Jimmy King, Ray Jackson, Jalen Rose, Juwan Howard. They had a guy named Eric Riley who played for the Houston Rockets, who was a backup on that team. Didn't even start, and he's an NBA player. And yeah, and then you had the UNLV teams with Plastic Man, Stacey Augman and all, all those guys. You had Greg Anthony was on that team. And there was just so much talent. And then Duke, of course, with, Hurley and Christian Leitner and Grant Hill. And I mean, and then Shaq, of course, at LSU, just an amazing amount of talent in college basketball back then. I feel people stayed longer too. They all stayed 4 years, most of them, not the Fab Five.
Yeah,
Most of those guys stayed 3 or 4 years. So you had these rivalries that would brew over a couple years where now, and I love college basketball, but it's all one and done. So you see a team for 1 year, then it's it. And, most of the teams going further now are the smaller colleges because they stay together for 4 years. So it's very
you're
different.
right. Is another crazy what if is if Bobby Hurley doesn't get into that car accident.
Yes.
He's a hell of a player.
Hell of a player.
Probably. Probably
Yep.
has a crazy NBA career as well. Like it's another guy kind of lost in the sands of time that, if you talk to a kid who is, 20 and watches some highlights and stuff, is not going to be familiar with, a guy like that.
There's kids today who don't even know how great Grant Hill was. Like they're like, wait, how good? I'm like, Grant Hill before his injuries. I mean, Grant Hill was top 5 in the NBA. That's how good he was.
Speaking of guys I was scared of, right?
Oh, for sure.
He gave Scotty some work. I was like, I'm not used to seeing this. Scotty's like the best. What? Yeah, man.
No question about it. And when I want to take it real quick to music, and we'll come back to a couple of questions about the Bulls in a little bit. But when you started when you're younger, when did you really get into music? What were some of the artists you got into early on, and how did you develop your love for what you do now?
So to take it back to the Jordan 4-5 jersey and stuff, I could literally remember I grew up in this neighborhood in Orange County. It was like condos. And it was a huge development, and each like section would have their own kind of like basketball court, community pool type thing. And I would spend most of my days playing basketball, wear my size 40 or 36 4-5 champion jersey, right? Hooping, doing a little swimming. And then when I would go home to get, eventually my mom would be like, we don't want heat exhaustion, like go sit in the house for a little while, right? So if she was at the pool and I would come sit at the house, MTV would be on. And what first caught my ear and my eye, I remember watching MTV, and it was Killing Me Softly. The Fugees version came on, and I remember like hearing the beat and just how I felt. And that was one of their R&B records, but then like I heard Fuji La and like the hip hop fusion to it. And I remember showing Killing Me Softly to my dad. Like I just discovered the craziest thing. And he's like, no, Roberta Flack did this song, but he's like, I got to give it to you. Like, I love what they did. He's like, I actually like this version better. So like my dad admitting that something that came out in the 90s was better than his version, I was like, I'm onto something. So I, kind of delved deeper from there and got into, your Biggie, your Nas, and then it became underground stuff. But the reason why basketball and hip hop are always, they're super intertwined, period. But for me, my personal journey, they're my two loves, So I played basketball up until varsity age, and then kind of fell out of favor with the coach. And looking back as someone that became an educator is not someone I have too favorable of a light on, and I'm not going to get too into why, but like, um, I didn't like that whole situation. And I was kind of, I always loved basketball, but I was like losing my enjoyment from for playing it at that level. So I'd experimented with hip hop and the freestyling and things like that. But when I decided to quit basketball, I definitely needed something else to like fill that void and that catharsis. So I started writing and doing kind of doing it myself. And one of my close friends who produced for me later on also was doing the same thing. And I became really passionate about it. It became my outlet. You know, when basketball used to be my outlet, like making music became my outlet. And I really gravitated towards hip hop because I was always, you know, I became an English teacher later on. I was always immersed in like the reading and the writing and in that kind of expression. So it was very natural, the poetic connection and the ability to like just in my basement on a 12 track make music by myself where I could express myself and I didn't have to wait on a band. I didn't have to I played with bands later, but like yeah, when I was young, it was a way I could just pick up and go and like escape and kind of drift off. And um yeah, but I later on now, I mean, I've made songs that the titular songs, you know, Go Westbrook was the song I did, kind of just about being going all out. You know, I had a song, it's another story, but a song I did called Like Kobe.
Yep.
Um, I actually made that song before he passed.
Oh,
And
really?
yeah, I did some work with his company, Granity. I was distributing their books, which were like it was like a almost the Wizarding series. It was like basketball meets Harry Potter, and I started like I had just left teaching full time, and I was still trying to do stuff with the schools, which I still do now, but in a different capacity. And one of those things was getting some books to reluctant readers because his kind of vantage point was like if I could take things like something like basketball and then add like this wizard element to it, it's kind of two check marks for kids who might not love reading to get into. So I remember talking to them on Instagram, them sending me a bunch, being like, sure, like pass these out in Baltimore schools. They sent me a case of the books. I went to the schools, I passed out the books. And I was just super inspired by his journey after basketball and just the fact that he already was getting award-winning film work and all of these things done. And it spoke to the fact that like, you know, Kobe was, as much as we call him this Jordan clone, and Phil Jackson has spoken on this, like, was not quite the athlete Jordan was. Like, you know, there was a few like great athlete, but not like Mike level athlete. The reason why he got close was because of his work ethic. And like when he applied that work ethic to something else, he not coincidentally got to an elite level. So like that was kind of the light bulb moment for me that it's like your approach and it's your work ethic. And like that's that killer instinct. And that's what that record's about. So when what happened, you know, that tragedy happened, we sat on it for a while, and then we did when we decided to release it. We decided to make a music video. The music video has this whole narrative of a father and daughter like hooping and stuff, and like it that was more of a tribute, but the song was more of a nod and like a so it was a tough thing to navigate because from when it was completed to when it was released, what happened. But I always like to tell people that in my correspondence on Instagram, as hands on as he was, I would like to think I was communicating with him at some point there. And I'll never know for sure, but whoever I was talking to was sharp and fast and I don't know. Like
I
I'd
bet it
like to
was.
think I was talking to him. Yeah.
I bet it was. It wouldn't surprise me one bit. I could see Kobe doing that. I just see him being hands on like that.
One can pray, man, but that is a whole obviously I didn't mean to like breach that topic when I was talking about whatever, but obviously for any of us, that is the a singular that's the when the music died, right? Of this generation. You know what I mean? Where it's like, this is never gonna make sense. This is never gonna be okay. I still think about it and I remember when it happened, I like literally wept like it was a family member. Like that was the worst thing. And it wasn't just him. Obviously, it was his daughter who like hadn't gotten to live her life, and who knows what she would have done for the women's game. Like
Yep.
she was an
Oh,
amazing,
it was incredible.
so that will never be, But that's, yeah, basketball is always super intertwined with what I do. I dropped another single recently called Wilt to Still. I'm always like doing these nods to players, and they'll always be intertwined for me. But it's the same journey. The roots of it are from those, outside in the summer, and I was hooping or I was in the AC watching music videos, and it's that formative time, that era, that early to mid '90s, which not coincidentally is kind of viewed as the golden era of both by a lot of people. So I'd
Yeah.
like to think that was kind of born out of that.
Oh, I'm glad you talked about like Kobe, because I was going to ask you about that actually later in the podcast. And you brought up how upset you were when he passed away, and I think I didn't know how much it influenced the younger generation. Like I have nephews who are all teenagers, and so they're pretty young when Kobe. They never saw Kobe when he won those championships back with Shaq, but they knew about him. I didn't know how big he was in that generation. I mean, he's huge in that. They all were going crazy when he passed away. I had no idea they even. I mean, I knew they knew who he was, but I didn't know how big he was. He's like, my nephew, who's 18 now, said, whenever we shoot we crumple up paper and put it in the trash can, we say, oh, Kobe, Kobe.
Kobe.
So I go, really? He goes, yeah. Yeah. I go, I didn't know that. So it was crazy. And then of course our generation. I mean, my best friend passed away many years ago. We were 19, or he was 19. I was 20. So, obviously he was alive. When we were in high school, was during that Kobe Shaq era. It was I was in high school from '98 to 2002.
Yeah.
So that era is I'm very sentimental to that era. And I remember literally being with him, and he wasn't really a big sports fan, but I'd be at his cottage up by Lake Erie, and we'd be sitting there with a bunch of people, and the Lakers would be on, and we sit there, he'd be doing something else, but we'd be sitting there watching it. And so it reminds me of him a lot too, even though he wasn't even a sports fan. It's kind of a weird thing. But so when Kobe passed away, I felt like I lost another piece of my childhood, because I mean, that's part of, like, I grew up watching him, and I was a kid watching him from, 7th grade or 6th grade all the way to a man. So it's just, and I was at the game, Rich, in Cleveland, the game after he passed away, the first game, everybody did the 24 shot, they all held the ball for 24 seconds and had the shot clock violation. Well, I was at that game in Cleveland. We played the Pelicans, actually Zion. It was Zion's first time playing in Cleveland. And I mean, it was incredible. Like, I don't know, you could feel the energy in the arena. It was sad, but it was an incredible feeling as far as his legacy, and how much he meant to the game. And, I mean, we'll never see another Kobe, obviously. I mean, MJ, Kobe, and LeBron, those are three guys we'll never see again. And, Kobe was Kobe. And he was his own person. I mean, he was different than MJ and different than LeBron. And I think that's what made him, like you said, his work ethic and how much he wanted it, how badly he wanted it, set him apart from so many other players in any sport. And I think that's why he was so beloved.
I agree with you. And that redeem team doc, like when those guys are like, when Wade and LeBron were saying they learned something, right? It's like crossing paths with him in the lobby. They're coming back from being out. What are you doing? Oh, I'm going to work out. You know what I mean? Y'all are going to sleep. I'm going to work out now. Oh, practice isn't until, no, I'm going now. And that, kind of seeing him as that elder statesman, and you're right. Like, as special as Jordan was to me, Kobe is just as special, because I remember him as the, like Mike put it, like watching him be the annoying little brother, right? Who was doing whatever he could. And even in that both the All-Star games, the 97, 98 to the one where Jordan hit that shot over Marion, and you think he's going to get it. And Kobe took it right back. And it was like, everyone showed deference. And I think, actually, I have like a lyric about this later down the line, but like everyone showed deference. Kobe showed a level of like reverence, but I'm not going to defer to anybody, and that was a fundamental difference. You see footage from these All-Star games, Jordan's in the locker room with them, and they're like looking at him like, I can't believe he's here. Like Kobe's like, I want to beat you, and honestly, even as an artist, I've worked with some of my favorites, and I'm continuing to collaborate with my heroes. But that's one thing I take from Kobe is like, when these things happen, I'm not looking at it as I'm happy to be here. Like, I'm looking at it as respectfully, when your fans hear this, I want them to be like, well, who the hell is that? And I would like to think anyone who I consider a favorite would have the same mindset. So
I love it.
Yeah.
And you mentioned that 98 All-Star game. I think that's, in my opinion, the greatest All-Star game of all time for many reasons, but one of them is because it's the Kobe Jordan All-Star game. And how could you really, and look at all the other guys in that game, just beyond them. I mean, you had just one superstar, one iconic guy after another. I mean, it was just, but to have those two in an all-star game like that, and the first one especially, that they played against each other, that to me, in Madison Square Garden, I mean, how do you get any better than that?
You're onto something with that. I've never really thought about what my favorite All-Star game is, and I think you're onto something with that because that was in a lot of ways the convergence of like you were talking about that 2000 early 2000s era being kind of dear to you because you were in high school. Same for me because we're around the same age, but that was like the convergence of that like late mid to late 90s dominant crew to like now your KGs, your AIs, your Kobe's, your Dunk, like they were all there at the same time that year. And that's pretty remarkable. I haven't thought about that a whole lot, but it really
I mean,
was kind of the best of both of those eras, you
no
know.
question about it. You had the Gary Paytons and you had Sean Kemp on the Cavs was in that All-Star game, and you had
Right.
Karl Malone, John Stockton. I mean, that think about the talent you had. I mean, I don't know if it was Dream. I think Dream was on that All-Star team. I can't remember, but I mean, regardless, I'm pretty sure he was. But that was just an incredible group of players. Like you said, that's a great way to describe it. Is that kind of that blend of the mid to late '90s stars with what will become the 2000 stars? So yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I would have to say for me, I mean, again, maybe there's another one I'm not thinking of. I know there was one in '92 where Magic came back and hit a three to win the game at the end, and that has to be up there too. But that '98 game, in my opinion, especially now that what's happened with Kobe's passing,
Yeah.
that might be my number one. I just don't see in that Madison Square Garden. I mean, how could you script that any better?
No, you really can't. I think did Rice win MVP that year? I
Rice
forget
won it in
who.
Cleveland the year before.
Okay, did Jordan get it in 98?
I think Jordan. Yeah, it was Jordan. I'm almost positive it was.
Okay,
Yep.
I remember one of the years Glenn Rice winning it.
No, you're right. That was in '97. Yep, that was a good memory. I think it was the year before in Cleveland. He hit a bunch of threes and he won it there. Yep.
He's another guy today, right? And then another one
Oh,
in that wing that like
6'8".
Mitch Richmond's the
Oh,
one I think about too because he was a two-way guy.
I just talked to Mitch the other day. Actually, I was trying to get him on the show as well, but he reposted one of my posts of him and Spud Webb that I put up a couple weeks ago, and he put it on his page. And Mitch is like, to me, I've told him before. I said I think you're one of the most underrated players ever. He never gets. Jordan will tell you that he was a tough guard. I mean, he had problems with Mitch Richmond. Guy was like 6'7", big, bulky, strong, could shoot from
The Rock.
lights out. The Rock, man, it's the Rock. It's
Yeah.
like, I mean, there's so many players from that era that are just like Rod Strickland, who I posted today. I mean, and I've talked to Rob before, like Rod Strickland. You can go down the list of guys. There's so many guys to me who are just criminally underrated and never really brought up in discussions when you talk about some of the greatest, when you talk about the greatest point guards of all time. I mean, I'm not saying, Strickland's a top 5 point guard, but he should be in the conversation of top 20, top 30. I mean, he was that good. And you're talking about a guy who I think he retired like 5th or 6th all time in assists. He could put up 20 a game. I mean, he's Kyrie's godfather. And you can imagine, and you can imagine those conversations with those two, like how to handle the Rock. I mean, two of the greatest ball handlers of all time. So, and then of course, Mitch Richmond, Glenn Rice. I mean, you can go on and on with a list of guys in that era that were just underrated, never really talked about. Even guys like Chris Mullin and Tim Hardaway. And I mean, there's so many guys back then that in this era, I mean, can you imagine any of those guys in this era, especially a guy like Mitch Richmond or Glenn Rice, who are big, strong wings who could defend and hit the three? I mean, it'd be ideal.
For sure. And I think again, like this, they didn't have the off the court stuff, but like this blends in with like to a degree about the market, right? Like he played for the Warriors, but then he spent a lot of that prime in Sacramento. And this is before like all these highlights are showing up on phones. So it's easy to get like if ESPN's not showing it, you know what I mean? If they're getting the just the score treatment, right, on Sports Center, or just the box score, like there's less of an idea. Whereas if he were playing today, aside from his game being conducive to like today's game, I think the fact that he would have been more accessible for kids to get to see, like kids would be able to say, oh, he's cold. Like, I don't care where he plays. Like did you see XYZ? Like repost, retweet, like, you know what I mean? Like that changes everything.
100%. Like Ja Morant. I mean, Ja plays in Memphis is not a major market, but he's on every reel you see on Instagram, half of them are Ja Morant dunks. So it's like, yeah, no doubt about it. He's another freak. I mean, that's a whole different conversation with Ja. But, in Cleveland, we have Donovan Mitchell playing in Utah for all those years. A lot of people here, and even some of the pretty big basketball fans didn't know much, and they knew he was a good player. They didn't know how great he really was. And I watched a lot of playoff games with Donovan, so I knew what he was all about. But I mean, when he came here, a lot of the fans here are like, oh my God, this guy's really good, like really good. And I told him, like, this kid, I'm telling you, this kid can play. And now I mean, obviously, 71 points a couple of weeks ago and all the things he's doing this year. But you're to your point, small market in Salt Lake City, no one really got to see Donovan. And now, not that Cleveland's a big market, but Cleveland's showcased a little bit more, and he's kind of he's blossomed this year really, and he's having the best year of his career. And I think that's to your point, and I think in this era, especially like having Donovan's not really a big guy on social media as far as doesn't post all the time, but like he just here it seems like he's found himself. And I feel like guys like Mitch and Glenn Rice and those guys, in this era, I mean, Mitch is a perfect example, like you bring up, would have been an absolute hit.
100%. Yeah, Donovan's having a tremendous year. And you guys are, through LeBron and winning the chip and everything. Like I consider Cleveland like a prominent basketball
For sure.
town, like in the national, like people care nationally what's happening there. So like with the NBA especially. So it's like I think he's getting his due, and I think he feels like the guy. Like he's not asking questions. You know what I mean? Like he's not looking over his shoulder at all. And there's not, I think in Utah, I think their fans are grateful for the guys they have, but I feel like time was up there. You know what I mean? It wasn't happening. He's another guy who, once he got the change, he could simply create buckets better than just about anybody. Like there's only a short list of guys who are better. And I think that was going to show its face in a new setting. And that's what's happening this year. So
No
on the 71 thing, question for you. I don't think it is with Donovan, because I think he's a great scorer, period. But like, to what extent, when you hear people talk about numbers today, are you like the inflation? Like I always say it's like the steroid era kind of right now, where everybody's approaching 60. You know what I mean? How do you feel? Like, what's your stance on that?
Yeah, I agree. I think you're seeing so many this year. How many 50-point games have we seen this year already? I mean, Luka had that 60-point. Yeah, there's a ton of them. Jason Tatum had a 50-point game. There are a ton of guys that had it. So I do think you have to take that into consideration. And I'm not going to sit here. As much as I love to prop up Donovan, and regardless of the era, 71 is still very impressive. But
for sure.
But I think back in the old days, they would have put him on his ass a lot of times and gave him a couple of elbows. And I'm not sure if he gets that. Donovan is that kind of freaky player. He can create shots all over the place. He could have gotten 50, I think, back then, but 71.
Sure.
And that's 71's. That's a whole. So yeah, I think you make a great point there, and I do take that in consideration. It is like the steroid era of baseball. And it's funny because I actually love that era of baseball, by the way, even though I know.
Me too.
Let's be honest about it. It helped. I had a couple of major league guys in this podcast, and they all kind of said it helped. Let's be real about it. It brought fans to the seats. I mean, it did. And not that I ever promote what they did, but it's, yeah. So in today's era, and even in the NFL today, with the offensive geared era where you can't really touch the quarterback, you can't do this, you can't do that. But I mean, people like watching high scoring games. They want to see Mahomes and Allen go back and forth all day. That's what they want to see. So it's like, I don't know. I guess it's all just different perspectives, but the old school fans of all the sports will tell you, we want more physicality. We want, I get that, but you also got to protect some of the players to some degree, because you can't have major injuries to to your stars, obviously. And that's why I think the leagues are trying to protect their assets. I mean, they're trying to protect the Patrick Mahomes and the Giannis's and those kind of guys. And, I understand that, but what is your take on all that as far as the physicality?
I'm right there with you. And it's funny you mentioned how it does, like, it's football, the same kind of stuff is happening, but with like, in light, especially over there, in light of like all this stuff we know about CTE now, it's almost kind of like the only way that's the only hand they can really play. With the NBA, I would love if we found something resembling a happy medium. I don't think it has to be as physical as it was in the 80s and 90s, but like, I also am not like, I love defense. So like when I see like the Matador defense, like, sometimes I'm just like, kind of eye roll, you know what I mean? Like it's just too easy. Yeah. And sometimes the effort looks like, recreation. I see guys at the Y playing harder on defense, I'm like, that's, but I respect the talent, and seeing these guys who are, as big as they are and can shoot and handle like they can. As a fan of the game, it's nice. It's just like interesting that like back then, you think Dream Team era, when they were playing against like European countries that had really good players, they still would just beat the crap out of them because they're so much stronger. And like now it's like, you wonder if they were to change the rules back, closer back, how it would look and how it would change everything. And I don't know. It's a crazy what if, but all we have is what the rules are and the players we have, and to enjoy what we got right now. And there is no question that there's a crazy amount of talent in the league. I just get a little when these kids. I argue basketball on Twitter probably more than I should, and I almost can't let it go when I see insert so and so's already doing what Jordan's doing or so and so. I'm like, dude, like I can't let it go that far, but I still try. Like, obviously, what Luke has done is remarkable, and I try to enjoy it, and I do enjoy it. But the '90s is still my high water, time for the sport.
I agree.
Um, and also, being a kid and having that much time to devote to that was all I was doing. So.
Well, and I think another thing about our era that was different, and you can argue it in good and bad ways, but the fact that there was no social media back then made watching Sports Center and waking up, and watching the actual games was much more meaningful, because unless you taped them, you weren't going to see them again for a while. So you kind of like everything was a little more. I don't know. It just had a different feel to it then. It was just, I keep using the word iconic, but like it was just different back then. It wasn't how it is now, where everything's so accessible all the time, and every highlight shown a million times. And back then you had to watch Sports Center or have it on tape to rewatch anything. So I think, just like watching Jordan live in those playoff games back then, there's nothing like that. I'm so glad that we got to experience watching MJ. Like, 'cause I mean, you can watch all the highlights now, and of course it's still amazing, but watching him live do that, like in '98 when he hit that shot to win, game 6, and he stole the ball, like you were saying, and probably the greatest sequence ever. I watched that with my brother. My brother was a great player himself, and we were watching it with my cousin, one of his buddies, and my brother. And I'll never forget. So my brother was a big Bulls fan. He loved the Cavs, of course, but the Bulls were his second favorite team because of MJ. And I wanted the Bulls to lose. I wanted the Jazz to win. So we were going back and forth. And to watch him hit that shot, I was just like, but to do it live and looking back now, Rich, I'm like, how truly amazing MJ was. Like I was so mad at the time because he beat my Cavs all the time and I hated him. Now I look back and I'm like, oh my God, that guy was just unbelievable. I'll never see a competitor like that ever again. I mean, 6 championships in 8 years. What he did, he didn't want to just beat you. He wanted to destroy you and rip your heart out every time. And there was no games off for MJ. He wanted to play through injuries. I mean, he was just a different kind of cat. And love him or hate him, I know there's some people who will criticize, some of the competitive things that he did. I'm not going to get into all that, but Dennis Hobson told me when they would drive to the arena, he said MJ would see me on the highway in Chicago, and he would try to get past me, and if he didn't get past me, we would pull up together and he would run out of his car to get to the door first to be the first one there. He goes, that's how competitive MJ was. He wanted to be first at everything. So it's almost like a sickness. I mean, he had to be, but that's why he won 6 championships.
Yeah, he straddled that line of like, this is maniacal, definitely.
Yeah, exactly.
And so you wonder too, like some of the off the court stuff today, it's with today's media and like all that kind of thing, it would have been different. But with what you were saying about the live aspect, I remember, like, if the Bulls were on the West Coast, if I didn't stay up, say they're playing the Clippers, if I didn't stay up to see that Sports Center, or to attempt to see that Sports Center, sometimes it was too late, and then the newspaper would come the next morning, and if I didn't get to see, like, if it was a West Coast game, I might not even get that score.
You're right. I forgot about that. Yeah.
And like I have a couple like really funny stories about this, the technology thing. 96, 97, the flu game. That's a game I actually had to watch a different way. And what happened was I got into trouble. I'm in 6th grade, and I got into trouble at a parent teacher conference. I like embarrassed my mom. So when I got home, what the punishment was, and the game was on that night.
Oh,
I think
man.
I think I hit something, like the kids were allowed to play outside. I think I like beamed a kid in the head with the dodgeball or something stupid, right? So just something impulsive and stupid. So like she's like, you're not gonna watch the game, blah 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 blah. So like I went upstairs and like pretended to be, I was upset, but I was like, oh, I guess I'll just go to sleep, blah blah blah. And I had like the little TV in my room, so I would periodically use the bathroom to try to get a pulse. And we had like, I could see kind of over the banister to what was happening downstairs. So like I'd periodically try to quietly take peeks. And then when I knew it was getting in the nitty gritty, because my mom was checking into my room periodically to make sure I wasn't watching it. Late fourth quarter, I turned on the TV and I put it on mute, and I watched the rest of the flu game kind of unfold, like the last few minutes. And then I remember like pretending to go downstairs to get something to eat and like, oh, oh, what happened? What happened? And then he told me. But like,
Oh shit.
I totally snuck watched it, and then I had one of my buddies tape it, so I was able to watch it in full. That was number one. Number two was in '98. We lost power during Game 7 against the Pacers.
Oh my God.
Lost
You
freaking
kidding?
power, dude. Yeah, so my grandmother called the house like once things were cut, and the Bulls won. The Bulls won. We were losing when the power went off. I was out of my mind, dude. This was Game 7. I'm like, this is it. This is the worst way for this to end. Like,
Oh, that is hilarious.
my parents are worried about the house and the power. I'm like, this is the least of our worries right now. Like, what are you doing? Someone take me to the nearest town.
Oh shit, man, that's great. Yeah, talk about two games you don't want to miss: the flu game and Game 7 against the Pacers. Oh my God, that's
Technology.
hysterical. And I completely forgot that you're right. When we were little, for those the younger generation listening, we had to get everything from the paper, all the stats the next day. So if they play like the Cavs played on the West Coast, Sacramento, let's say, if you didn't see the game, you didn't get those stats the day after that, like 2 days later, because the game wasn't over on time. So they couldn't publish the paper on time. So yeah, you would have to, it would say, Cavs played Kings yesterday, but they wouldn't have any final or anything. So you had no idea what happened. Now, if you didn't watch SportsCenter, especially, you really had no idea. So it's kind of funny how that was back then. And that wasn't that, 20, 25 years ago. And, it was just so different when we were a kid compared to now. But I'm glad we grew up in that generation because it was just so different. And I like having those memories. It's kind of fun looking back in that.
For sure. And everything was like, I know this generation, it's like you have the quick, something could happen on Instagram Live, or like you could see things happen on Twitter. But like, let's take a dark incident like the OJ situation and the Bronco happens during the finals. There's a commercial, there's an interruption, and like that's how some people are seeing it, as like a news break. Like, we saw everything happen, unfold, like that energy of it unfolding live, like you said, really can't be duplicated. Like, it's a different kind of, I think that access that they have now, they don't really get the same level of excitement, of chance, of you're there with it when it happens. Like, it's different. So
Oh, you're 100% right.
I feel for them with that.
Yeah, I know. I agree. And I know that they're growing up with things that we'll never experience. I mean, I'm not trying to bash any generation. I mean, I like my nephew's generation's awesome. I know a lot of the kids in that generation because of them, they're friends, and I have a lot of cousins who are that age. So I love their generation, but it's just a totally different thing. And they are so used to accessible information in 2 seconds. And that, they don't, for us, it was just so different. You had to go to the library when we were younger to get certain information, especially I was researching a science project. I couldn't just look on the internet. I had to go to the library and research, 10 books and pick out certain chapters. And so it's just so different. And of course, I appreciate what we have now. But like you said, that rawness of seeing things live, and even the horrible things we saw, the horrors that we saw, like 9/11 or the Oklahoma City bombing, unfortunately, when you saw it live, it did bring a different feel. It was more of a scary feel to me, than having everything kind of rehashed a million times like it is today. But back then, I remember seeing 9/11 as it was happening. It was terrifying. It was horrifying.
I remember that too. And living in New York, my stepmom actually worked at the Millennium Hilton Hotel, which was like right next to there. I had like an aunt that was in the building but got out before everything happened. A lot of really terrifying things, not being able to get a hold of people. I worked for this sunglasses, and it was an optician, but he had like a sunglasses store and also sold glasses. And that was one of my early jobs, and I was there because he was also a volunteer fireman. So he went down there like that day, and I was working. Like, he needed somebody. I remember watching everything happen at school. They rolled the TV in, and we saw that, and everybody was scared. And if anyone had relatives, they were to go to the office. And then I was working that day, and I remember this guy was calling me at the store. I took phone calls, and the guy's asking me about these prescription Oakley lenses. And after like 15 minutes, I was like, "Sir, if you turn on your television," and he's like, I'm gonna talk to your manager or your boss. I'm like, "Please do." Like, he's literally fighting the situation down there. He'll be glad to tell you to F off when he comes back. Like, so like,
Classic New Yorkers. I love
yeah,
it.
it was because he's clear, he is the customer technically, right? But I was just like, dude, what do you do? Like, let's talk about the Oakleys later, you know? Like,
Well, I want to get, actually, I want to ask you another question about that, because I've watched so many documentaries on 9/11, and it's interesting because of New Yorkers mentality. You know, we know the whole thing about New Yorkers, but like, I heard so many people on those documentaries say that we saw more like love and giving, and like coming out of the towers, especially people were in those towers. So we saw more people helping each other, you know, and it was kind of like even though it was the worst day in the history of New York, there was also a lot of beautiful things that happened, you know, within all the mess of what was going on, of people helping each other, people who had no idea who the other person was, giving a helping hand, carrying people out of the buildings. You know, have you heard what stories have you heard about that personally? Have you know anybody that was like, everyone that you were involved with in New York, you know, do you have a couple stories you can share?
I mean, that level of kindness was definitely something that I saw a lot more of, just because New York's one of the most resilient places, you know, on earth. I don't have too many, like, I was still in high school at that time, and outside of my boss being like the volunteer firefighter and knowing some people who lost relatives, I don't have like the explicit, you know, stories of kindness per se, especially growing up about an hour away from New York City. But I just do remember that general, like, with New York, the attitude's always us against the world. And that is a time when I remember just the world hardcore, like really being with New York. Um, to the point that, I mean, some people were even rooting for the Yankees, you know, which, you know, exceptional circumstances happening. And it was to
Yeah.
no avail that, you know, but yeah, man, like I do remember that time period being, you know, a lot of melancholy, but also like, you know, people really standing with New York a lot more. And to fast forward a little, like, that was why, like, I knew people who moved to New York, you know, were kind of transplants for work, and they did like they thought they were like doing the chic New York thing, living in insert gentrified Brooklyn neighborhood and like whatever they're doing. And then it's like COVID happens, and oh, they're moving out and this person's leaving. And it's like, how is New York going to recover from this? But anyone from New York knew that, you know, having something like 9/11 happen and bouncing back, and like anyone from New York knew that they were going to be fine and that New York was going to be fine. And like, I think that's why when everyone was like, oh, property values plummeting here or there or wherever, I'm like, it's going to be back, you know, it's going to be back. Like, New York is New York. And I think aside from the kindness, that those moments call to the toughness. And, you know, people talk about the glitz of New York, but what they don't talk about enough is, you know, kind of the blue collar nature of New York and the people who really put that city on their back for years, you know, having both my parents are from the Bronx, you know what I mean? And like that, it's just tough, hardworking people have always, and diverse people have always been at the core. That was one thing my dad, when he lived in LA for a bit, and he said he missed, he's like, you know what I missed? I missed like dirty water hot dogs and people with joggers that didn't match and were ripped and had yellow teeth. Like, that's what I need that. I need that. I wasn't getting that in LA as much then. And, you know, that's what I think of New York. I think of grit, toughness, resilience, you know, and people actually being, obviously we have our opinions, you know, but people are, I think, would be surprised at the kindness you can find in New York as well.
Wow, that's great. And I had a cousin lived in New York for over 20 years, actually. She lived in Yonkers. So, you know, and then she went to Fordham University. It was actually her and her husband were at Fordham during 9/11. So she told me some stories about that. It was pretty interesting. But yeah, so I mean, it's funny. She's moved back to Cleveland recently, and she wanted to be back home, obviously, because all her family's here. But, you know, she was going to Manhattan for years working down there. And then she took me all around New York, all 5 boroughs in one day. And that was my first taste in New York years ago. And I loved it. I mean, it's such I tell people who've never been there before, like, it's so different than anywhere you'll ever go. It's just so, the food, first of all, the food, don't even get me started. Like, oh my, you can have a vendor on the side of the road has best crepes I've ever had in my life. And I'm like, let's get some here. Okay. I'm like, what the hell is that? Unbelievable food. The people watching in New York is unlike anything you'll ever see. And I lived in LA.
Top tier.
I lived in LA for a year. I lived in Venice Beach area for a year. So there were great people watching out there. New York was even better. New York was just, I mean, unbelievable. And just like the fast paced environment of it. And I don't know, it's just such a unique area and greater New York in general. Like you said, the people are very resilient. And after watching all those 9/11 documentaries, I couldn't believe what some of those people went through. I mean, just some of the most horrific stuff you could possibly imagine. And the firefighters, I mean, to lose all those firefighters and police officers and first responders. And I mean, it was some of the saddest things I've ever watched. And I, as a kid, when it happened, I was in high school when it happened, I was a senior. You just didn't realize the gravity of how big it really was till I got older. I knew it was huge, obviously, but you didn't realize how big it was until I started really watching these and seeing the inner workings of people losing family members and what it did to their family and just horrific stuff. But like you said, it seems like from the outside, New Yorkers are extremely resilient.
And what you said about the firefighters and the first responders and the police department, like that's where like, and not to politicize things, but like when it comes down to like today's climate, like there might be people that see an NYPD and have this like visceral reaction, negative, and maybe for their experiences it's warranted, but like to some people, like that's what NYPD means. You know what I mean? Like you don't know the person wearing that hat, like they're the life of someone they care about could have been saved that day by a police officer.
Yep.
You know what I mean? And like that's what my dad was a cop. He's a retired New York City cop, and like these are the things that where there are people who do some terrible things and who make some mistakes, and I'm not saying they shouldn't be prosecuted to the fullest. I stand in solidarity with all of that and any abuse of power, but like then there's the actual majority, you know what I mean, who they don't get a cookie or a shout out or put every good deed on social media. You know what I mean? Like
Nope.
what they do in the course of their day or career. And I like think back to things like that these guys are running into this building without any fear. Now they probably did have fear, but they didn't have regard for themselves like they had for other people. It was like, whoever's in there, we got to get out. They may have been terrified. They may have been blocking that out, whatever, but like, you have to admire that. And so whenever I see that kind of thing or somebody thrown under the bus for showing some support for that, I'm like, well, context is king here,
No question about it. I agree with everything you just said. And I think when they showed a picture of a firefighter walking up one of the stairwells, and the look on his face was just, I'll never forget seeing, and then one of the documentaries, and he knew he probably wasn't coming back down, and to think that he did that knowing he was going to save other people while he could. I mean, that you said, and then all the different people who did that. I mean, there was thousands of people, first responders within that area who risked their lives to do that. And a lot of them didn't make it out. So like you said, you never know what, and those people aren't going to be on social media. They're not going to be glorified. I mean, you don't even know who some of these people are. And I don't know. I feel that watching those documentaries for me, cause we all lived it back then in high school, but I was in high school and you're kind of an idiot back then. You don't really fully get.
You are.
I was partying. It was horrible. We knew it was terrible, but now that I'm older, I look back, I'm like, that was really like a messed up time. What happened that day. And then just seeing what those people, some of the people who survived suffer, just the PTSD and the years of suffering and physical ailments. Yeah. I have a hell of a lot of respect for anybody, who went into anywhere around those buildings to help people, because I don't know if I would have been brave enough to do that. I mean, that you're putting your life on the line big time.
And I agree with that. And what you're saying with the high school piece, that's why with like the specific anecdote, as much as I should have some, I was like kind of still an alien as a human. And I also think it was kind of being somewhat close to it. It reminded me of the way that COVID-esque fog where you're just trying to be and to get back to like something normal. And like, that's where you're focused, right? Like just that day to day of it. Cause we used to go to that hotel all the time. Like
Did you really?
Yeah. Cause my stepmom
Wow.
would do this manager on duty thing at the hotel, which entailed her working all weekend and me and my dad living a life that we, don't like this white robe life for a couple of nights while she's on call. Like I had my own part of the room. Like this was not real life, but there was a mall in the World Trade Center. So we used to go down to that and like, see it. And I do remember that distinct feeling of seeing it when I would go to the city to no longer ever seeing it, which is weird. And as cool as like the Freedom Tower, as cool as all those things are, it's not ever going to be quite what that was like. And rightfully so. I don't think they should have just rebuilt the same thing. I don't think that would have been the right thing to do. So that's just going to be one of those things that stands out as a singular moment in, our country's history and our age range, like our lives. You know what I mean? We'll never, not to be too on the nose, but you will never forget that day. Like if you
Uh,
were cognizant of anything, that day is going to stand out.
No question. That was our Pearl Harbor. I mean, Pearl Harbor. That was that day for
Yeah.
us. I'll never forget it. I saw actually a fighter jet fly over my high school in Ohio, and I went outside, and that was when they grounded all the planes. Which we lived not where I grew up in Cleveland. I was probably about 30 minutes from the airport, roughly. I was in the west side suburb of Lake Erie, and I had senior pass. So I think the second plane had just hit. I don't think the tower had. I don't think any of the towers had collapsed yet. But I walked outside to go to my senior pass, and I remember seeing a fighter jet come over. And it was so eerie. And I never knew, I finally realized it came from Toledo. So which I guess they dispatched I don't know if it was Flight 93, one of them that was coming over Ohio, and they dispatched, multiple fighter jets, but I did see one come over. And I had someone else saw it too. And for years, people kept saying, "Oh, you didn't see a fight." I'm like, I saw a fighter jet. I know I did. It was verified. I don't know how recently, but it came from Toledo. So it was just really eerie. And again, my nephews asked me about 9/11 because they weren't alive then. It's so weird to think that. And they're always like, "What was it like?" And I'm like, it's just, I can't even describe it. It was just so, I mean, it was definitely life changing in the sense that the whole country, I was terrified to fly for years. And I think a lot of people
Yeah.
had that fear, and it was just a change. And obviously you being a New Yorker, you have a whole different perspective on it, but for just outside of New York, it changed our lives because you looked at everything differently, terrorism, air travel. It was just, and unfortunately it had a lot of negative consequences for people of Muslim, Muslim faith. I had a friend who was Muslim, and he got a lot of hate because I had multiple friends actually. He got a lot of hate, and he was the greatest kid ever, and he got, unfortunately got a lot of hate because of it. So it was just, it was a very different time, and it changed. I think it changed our reality, and it's to this day. I don't think it was ever going to be the same, pre 9/11. But yeah, you make some great points about all that. And I wanted to ask you real quick, what was it like looking at those towers? How massive were they?
That's especially at that age that I was when I was there. I mean, there's nothing in my life, nothing to scale really. You know what I mean? I've been to Chicago, never saw like the Sears Tower because I was passing through on a tour situation. I didn't even get to see the Jordan statue. I just got some perform, got some deep dish and left. So I've never really seen anything to scale of those towers, nor do I think I could like duplicate it because there was like that wonderment was there still, especially seeing it as an elementary schooler or a middle schooler. Like there'll never be that feeling again. And for there to be two of them, it was just it was special. It was that skyline was the most New York, the defining New York thing. You know what I mean? It's unforgettable. But I do think it was right that they didn't try to like recreate that. That was just
I
meant for
agree.
the time. Yeah.
100%. Okay, so I want to ask you a couple questions musically. Give me your top 2 or 3 hip hop artists of all time.
Mm.
I'm going to put you on the spot.
So is this like personal favorites, or is this
Okay,
like if I'm
both.
it like favorite players versus like best player? Or is both?
Both.
Okay.
Yep. So give me both.
Ooh. I would say, and I take Impact into this. So for one, I will take Impact, all of those other intangible factors, and for one, I'm just gonna go like kind of raw skill favorites. I've got Jay-Z. If I'm talking all-time best kind of thing, I have Jay-Z. I have Nas. And then I'd probably go Biggie just because the way he was able to, like his versatility to make a record that was like a club record, but was still so like on point. And there's a little bit of, I think his impact, like he died when he was only 23, but like, I think his impact was just like so defining and his apex was so crazy that probably put him there. And then obviously I have love for M too, but like to be honest, like M's later work I haven't been that crazy about. Like he's been doing this super like almost technical for the sake of being technical kind of stuff. Always will love and respect him, but like I haven't really been a fan for long enough of the recent stuff. And as far as like I think my favorite slash the most advanced, I go Lupe Fiasco.
I love Lupe. Yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah, I love Lupe. He's teaching at MIT now, which is awesome.
Really?
Yeah, he's doing like it's I'm gonna butcher the name of the course, but he's there now, which is great.
And he's from Chicago, isn't he, originally?
Yeah, he's
I
from
thought, yeah.
Chicago. He had some commercially successful stuff, and then he kind of stopped playing the game. I'm actually like, I do a lot of the hip hop education stuff, and there a lesson I'm working on that's kind of cross curricular between um, English and science, and I'm using a song he did called "Dinosaurs" as a anchor for it, and I'm going to pair it with like an informational text and try to like have students take scientific pieces of Lupe's verse out. Like he does like a rar noise, and he's like, they probably didn't sound like that, and like he has all these little cool and how they're fossil fuels and like these different cool little tidbits mixed with pop culture stuff. It's really fun. So I can't wait. I'm not an everyday classroom teacher anymore, but like I still work on curriculums and with the Beats Not Bullets program. So I get to kind of have the best of both worlds. But long story short, I'm going to use some of his stuff academically. My second favorite in terms of pure technical skill, probably Black Thought from the Roots.
All the Roots. Yep.
Yeah, it's funny that a lot of people know him as like, Tariq from Jimmy Fallon, right? But like I'm like, no, this is like one of the greatest rappers of all time. I put him right there. And then third, there's a guy who passed away some years ago. His rap name was Idea, and he was in this group called Idea and Abilities. And Abilities is a producer and a DJ, phenomenal DJ. But Idea might be my biggest influence stylistically, and he also was a great off the top of the head freestyler and battler, and that's a lot of my earliest stuff was that way. But he could emote really well, but also be really hyper technical and like had he stayed with us, I think he'd be near the top of a lot of lists. But I also have to say, somebody from my other list, one thing I admire about Jay-Z, and this is similar to like my favorite author being like Ernest Hemingway, I think there's a lot to be said for someone that can say something in a very simple universal way, but then it's like the iceberg kind of thing where you see the top of it, but it's deeper, it's dense, it's layered. And that's like the hallmark of Jay-Z is he could deliver this verse that could be a hit, but he's sneaking some triple entendre in there. And I think his skill level is like really lost, on some people. But so he's like probably my overall number one if I had to pick one. But yes, do love Lupe, and I'm glad you do too, because it's good taste.
all the guys. I don't know Idea though. You got to name Idea. What? Give me a little more about him, because I'm not familiar with him.
So he won. There was it was actually in Ohio. Scribble Jam used to be in Ohio, and it was a hip hop event. And one of the things they had was the freestyle battle. Eminem actually lost in the finals at Scribble Jam to a guy named Juice, who's from Chicago. Probably my pick for greatest freestyler of all time.
Really?
But yeah, Eminem then went to the Rap Olympics, and that's where he got Andre's radar and all that. But he got he got to the finals of Scribble Jam, which Ohio-based hip hop festival.
So this is going like late 90s, probably mid-late 90s.
Yeah, this is back and to the 2000s.
That's okay. That's why I was a little kid. I was wondering why I'd never heard. Okay, interesting.
But like Idea, like 2000s. He did the Blaze Battle on HBO. He won that. He won Scribble Jam a few times. But he was just so like quick on his feet and like I don't know, like used his voice perfectly to me. Like there's a lot of things that he did, and he was just unapologetically himself, and just not afraid to turn down some rappers who could be really technical. And I used to have this problem, and I have to call it a problem. Like they're afraid to like let that technicality lapse at any moment. Like they're almost trying at all times to show you like how proficient they are with words. And like if you do that, it's like the equivalent of an author who just writes in a very flowery, like highbrow way, where they might be using the craziest techniques, or like the musician who never does anything by ear and is like just solely theory. Like sometimes you lose the heart and soul in that. So like, I think the best people like have the technical upside when they want to, but they also know when to turn it on and off. And like my dad like said to me, like sometimes the best thing you could say is what you don't say, and like leaving that little bit of breathing room, like, you know, taking out something that might be unnecessary, and you learn that giving a little space and, you know, can make for some of the best music, you know. So I learned that from, you know, all the people that I just mentioned there, that it's not, if you're technicality on 11 all the time, like it's not going to make for the most enjoyable listening experience. People get tired of it. Like
Yeah.
have those marks, but like a boxer, like you can't throw haymakers the whole time. You got to jab, you got to move. And so I try to think of it that way. And I do employ the boxing idea a lot when I'm doing a verse, is like, you know, when I'm jabbing, when I'm punching, when I'm showing restraint, when I'm having a flurry, like I try to like make it analogous to that.
Who are some of the favorite people you've worked with?
On the Like Kobe record, I worked with Joel Ortiz, who he was in Slaughterhouse, which was a rap group that was signed at Shady Records, Eminem's label. He was in that with like Joe Budden, Royce the 5'9", King Crooked. He is a guy, he's from New York, and he's somebody who listening to for years and years was always one of my favorites. So to have a chance to work with him, and then like I was talking about, like Kobe, like I'm not going to say like I outshined him or anything like that, but like I sounded, my favorite thing about listening to that record is being like, you belong there. You know what I mean? Like that was like confirmation, because he's an elite lyricist. But he's one of my favorite collabs for that reason. Um, I'd have to put that as number one. Recently, I got a song coming out in February with Wordsworth, who did the Lyricist Lounge show, MTV's Lyricist Lounge show, and he actually wrote all of his college essays in some kind of rhyme form.
Really?
Yeah, and became a teacher later on, and we're working together on a few things on that side of the fence. But he was one of the guys when I was in college. My first year, I did community college, but my first semester away, I was pretty isolated, kind of a bit of that homesickness, and I kind of fell into like my craft. And I was a literature major, so I was just reading and writing and then writing rhymes like all the time. And I needed to listen to stuff that would keep me humble and like hungry. And I listened to a lot of Wordsworth because he was just so effortless and so good, and like uh, so witty and dense with and intricate with his stuff. So to get to work with him later on, that was super cool. And I feel like I like manifested it, because we did we were at South by Southwest for both the music, and they have an EDU portion. And on the EDU side, we did a panel about hip hop education. But then I was like, great that we're doing the panel, but let us show you in practice how this works. So they gave us a showcase too. And all of us panelists got to perform as well and show how it looks. And then after the performance, they came back to our hotel room, and my producer, business partner, engineer was with me, and we ended up recording a song. And to watch Wordsworth, one of my like heroes, record a song in my hotel room after we just did a panel of show, it was like out of body. And it's another song that came out great. Comes out in February, but it's another song that I was like, okay, I sound like I belong next to him. So, and it's not just about these affirmations for me, like that's part of it, but it's also just this is the equivalent of playing, you know, one-on-one or on a 2-on-2 team with like your favorite player, like, or one of them. It's wild, but again, it's reverence, not deference for me ultimately, because I know that I belong next to those guys. But I would say Joel Ortiz and then Wordsworth are probably my two favorite collabs.
That's got to be incredible to do that, to work with like your idols, you know, and then people who I can't imagine what that feeling like.
It's pretty cool, man. I also have to. There's a producer and a DJ. He goes by Static Selecta, and he has a show on Shade 45, and he's broken a lot of like up and coming acts. Like I think he was the first guy to have Mac Miller like freestyling
Oh,
on
really?
Major. Yeah, he'll do anything from work with insert biggest name in rap, right? Like he's worked with like damn near everybody and works with these huge guys, but he also is cool enough that if he likes what someone does, and it's the underdog or it's the up and comer, you know, he'll have that person on the show too. He'll look out for that person. and that's really dope to me if like you never lose track of like that, regardless of how much, because somebody as successful as him doesn't need to do that. He's doing that for the love of what he does, and because he probably remembers what it was like to be on the other side of that, to know you had the chops, but not necessarily the opportunity. And I think that's because these guys, if they wanted to, would just take money for those pay slots, for those time slots, and get richer and richer, but like the guys who look out, who have big time access, but still look out for the up and comers and keep their ear to the streets, so to speak. Like those guys are, we did one record together, but he's had me on there to freestyle a couple times. And like, I've, I won't forget that. And I really appreciate that.
So when you look back at the history of hip hop and rap from, the old days to now, what do you, I guess, like, how have you seen the change? Like when I grew up, I listened to, and hold on one second. I got to plug sorry.
Yeah, I might check.
Okay. I had my low battery came up. So when you look back, like I grew up listening, like, so my brother and my brother's friends listened to a lot of like, this back in there, he's 10 years older than me. So they're listening to like Public Enemy and NWA and, Beastie Boys and all those 80s stuff. And then I got into like West Coast gangster rap. So I was Dre and Snoop, obviously. Nothing But a G Thing came out when I was in second grade, and that like blew away my whole generation. It was like nobody had ever heard anything like that before. And Dre's beats, how that is out there. Ice Cube, I was a big Ice Cube fan. 3 6 Mafia, and you had like I love the Ghetto Boys. So a lot of this is like early 90s. Yeah. You would know all the old school stuff. Yeah. And then of course one of my favorites was Old Dirty Bastard. I loved ODB. I thought he had a very unique, he was a very raw, like unique talent. I'm a big fan of Devin the Dude, who came out late 90s. A lot of people don't know who I love Devin the Dude.
Super underrated.
Yeah. Very underrated. And a lot of people always say that he's your favorite rapper's favorite rapper. A lot of people love Dev, but I was going to ask you about him too, because I still listen to his stuff, and he's been doing this for 25 years. And so many of my generation doesn't even know who he is. I'll say, you don't know Dev? And like, no, I've never heard of Dev before. I'm like, man, he's fantastic. I love him. His first couple albums, I'll put him up against anybody's. And absolutely great.
Yeah, it's stylistically too, just really like an originator,
Yes.
Like, another like one who reminds me of that is like Adele the Funky Homo Sapien,
yes.
is like,
yep,
who is actually Ice Cube's cousin. But his people will know him from the Gorilla stuff, but like he is another one of these dudes who just killed it album after album, and like doesn't, but they're good anyway. Like they have their publishing, like they're fine. But yeah, in that mainstream like vantage point, they're not as revered as they should be. There's a bunch of guys like that.
Agree. I'm sure you can. Deep, it's so deep. And I'm just talking, think about it. All I've really mentioned is 90s stuff. We haven't even gotten to the 2000, 2010. That's a whole different conversation. But, and I've left out, obviously Bone Thugs and Be Real and Cypress Hill. And there's some Beastie Boys. It goes on and on and on. It was such a rich era. And then that kind of transitioned to the 2000s. And the 2000s had just as rich of an era of hip hop and rap. And then nowadays, and my nephews actually are turning me on to stuff now, Rich. Like I didn't, half the stuff they listen to, I didn't know. And they'll say, check out this person, check out that person. So it's cool to have them now all into this. And they're feeding me music all the time. Cause I was, back when we were younger, people give you mixed CDs and stuff. So you'd always have this new stuff coming. That's how I found out about Lupe years ago, as it was in college and someone gave me like a mixed CD. I was like, oh, okay. But now it's all, check out this guy on Spotify. Uncle Brad, check out this. I can't keep up with all, but there's so many new artists coming out now that I don't know how I even do it anymore. But how do you view that transition from the 80s, 90s to now? Like, what has changed?
That's a really good question. I think like the style that we love is still there. It's just harder to sift through with as like saturated as it's become, because somebody gets a MacBook for Christmas and 2 weeks later they're a rapper and a producer, and like
that's true.
It used to be like, we had to get a 12 track, and my 12 track was in my parents' basement. Like I'm like mixing these things analog myself and like burning the CDs and doing this Microsoft Paint looking art myself and selling the CD. There was a level of going to battles and like being ready as a rap. If you said you were a rapper, like wherever I went, I had to be ready to be challenged, and like they won't understand that. It was like some samurai shit almost, and like that's changed. And it's like interesting to like see something that was so predicated on skill you know, in some ways kind of devolved to where it's considered like not cool to be too heady. And I'm like, I'll always push back against that because I'm like, no, whatever, you know, you want to do something different, call it something different. But like the best hip hop is poetry at its highest form. It's supposed to be like thought provoking and visceral at the same time. I'm like, you know, I think, you know, I'm not the biggest fan of a lot of stuff that comes out today, but like that's just kind of drenched in auto tune and like,
Okay,
but
okay. I want to cut you off real quick. I say the same thing. I can't tell half these rappers apart now because they all are using autotune. Like back in the day, the guys I mentioned, Dev or Snoop or you know, Easy E, you can. I mean, everyone had a distinct style and a distinct voice. When you heard Biggie, you knew it was Biggie. When you heard Pac or whoever, you knew it was them. I can't tell half these guys apart. Am I wrong on that, or is that, you know? I mean, I just, that's my biggest beef with today's era.
you're not wrong. And it's similar to like style, like with that access comes like, oh, I want to do this too. And it's so it ends up being super derivative and like, but part of I have some theories on this. Like, I think the reason why some of these shows are like karaoke and simpler is because this is a generation kind of predicated on I'm not filming who's on stage at the concert. I'm filming myself at the concert. So if this is easy to sing along to and I could just jump around and do it and film myself, that's better than a phones away experience. You know what I'm saying for them. Uh, and I think that also they like the idea. It's like this American idolization almost of society where they they want it to be them too. So like if it's someone that seems like it's reachable with the right image or marketing plan, or I could practice a little bit and be that. I think they're attracted to that because they see themselves in that more than this person doing this thing that seems almost unattainable, you know? So with that said, I think this generation also is a lot more creative on the fly and understands like you have to do something to catch someone's attention in 30, you know, in 10 seconds, forget 30, 5 seconds. Like there's a magic in that creativity and that ingenuity. And I think that they really shine in that respect. And I also think like coming up now, you do with the internet and your own ingenuity and your own work ethic, you really have no excuse not to do something if you're working hard enough. And I have a lot of people that are in our age range who, oh, I can't XYZ today. And I'm like one quick example I'll give you, and I'm not the biggest artist on there, Spotify. I initially was like, I don't want to put any effort into this, any money, any time. I'll put songs on there, sure. But why am I going to care about something that's paying me by the red cent when I can sell albums and yada yada? Small-minded look on my part because I wasn't seeing it as what it is. It's not so much, sure, it could become a stable revenue stream, but really it's more about fan discovery and tricking the algorithm. And you wind up on somebody's, you know, playlist next to Devin the Dude because you made something that sounds that way, or like the algorithm thinks you go together. Like that's the stuff that makes it worthwhile because then those become your fans and you're given regional analytics to see where they are. And you could take those regional analytics and bring them to a concert promoter and say, hey man, look, I have X amount of listeners in Phoenix. Like I've been killing it in Phoenix. What's good with opening for so-and-so and coming out there? And if you can make use of the tools of discovery at your disposal, that's what's a great thing about today's generation is you can kind of hurdle the gatekeepers, you know, like, and people that fancy themselves as the end all be all curator. Like there was a time where you needed that. You needed that contract. You needed XYZ. Like now, if you work hard enough and you're creative enough, you're going to get there, like regardless. So straight direct to consumer marketing and all that kind of good stuff. So I think you see a lot of kids, like I might not like their music, but I respect their hustle and their business acumen and their willingness to go all in and all of those things. So you don't get as much of the entitled, I could just sit back and be, I tell people, I work at a program called Beats Not Bullets, and I tell those kids early, you being a talented artist, congratulations. Like now you're able to look at the mountain. You haven't even started climbing it yet. Your talented artistry is why you can see it. You know, like now comes everything else. And if you're not willing to get your hands dirty and do that other stuff, you're not gonna get there today. And I think that's kind of cool, you know, in a way.
That's such great advice too. And I'm trying to teach. I'm actually in business with my nephew. I have a side hustle I do with him in marketing. We have a marketing company, and we do social media for former professional athletes and some other people. So we just started this recently, and I've been doing it for some NBA players for years now. And I was telling my nephew who works with me, I said, this doesn't come overnight. Like you have to, he's learning that, when you take on a client, sometimes it takes a couple months to get him in the door. Like, you might talk to somebody 4 or 5 times. You got to keep going back and say, it's not as because they want everything so quickly and they think everything's going to happen so quickly because everything with them is within seconds, like you said. And I said, when you build a business, it's like anything else. It just takes time. You're not, it's effort, time, it's persistence. And, things might not pan out the way you wanted at first, but you got to keep going at it. So the point to all that is like, I think this younger generation has so much talent, and my nephew and all my nephews are so talented in different ways. And they're incredibly like into art. And I mean, when it comes to social media, they can do things that I don't even know. And I'm pretty good at social media, and they're blowing me away. I'm like, oh my God. So they're just so talented, but some of them, not all of them, but some of them do have, they don't necessarily always understand what you have to do, what it takes to get to a place, and they're still young. But I think they do. I will say a lot of them are understanding the side hustle, and they're understanding that because of the internet and because of how easy things are now, as far as getting noticed, it's very saturated, but you can still get noticed, like you said. So they're starting to kind of realize that. And it's just, I don't know, it's a different generation in a lot of good ways. I think they get bashed a lot, which I think is unfair. But I think when it comes to they're going to be running the world 20, 30 years from now. And I think they're a little more diverse, I think, because of the access they have on the internet to everybody. When our generation, like I grew up in a pretty much all white suburb in Ohio.
Right.
So, now I had, family members and stuff and other people who we had other types of people around us, but not like now on the internet where you go on the internet and you can see everybody to them, race and religion, that kind of thing is not a big deal to them because they see all that. I think that's the one good thing about all of it is that for as much hatred as we see online, there is a lot of acceptance because of who they're playing video games with. They might be playing video game with some kid in a totally different country. They don't care what he looks like. They don't care what his politics are. They just play with them. I think that's cool.
I do too. I think that's the best thing about this generation is they're growing up where it's not cool to bully somebody because they're different, and I think that's absolutely massive. And they don't get enough credit for that their empathy and their kindness. And now the people who do that are the ones who get bullied. You know what I
Yes.
mean? And,
Yes.
and that's the way it should be. And I was the type of person that I was kind of friendly with everybody, when I was in high school. But like I look back, and there are instances where maybe somebody I was cool with was getting, things were said, and I may not have laughed, but I also didn't intervene, and not that I so much feel guilt about it, but it's one of those things that's like, if that's today, people are like, dude, shut up. Like, you're an idiot, like, why would you criticize? They have ways of quickly clapping back about why that is not the way.
Mhm.
Intolerance is not the way. And I think that that's a beautiful thing. And
That's a
I
beautiful
do,
thing.
as much as they scare me in some ways, I look I look forward to seeing more people like that, like, kind of getting the reins. And I think the old guard is obviously quite terrified of that
Oh yeah, yeah, they
because
are.
it's coming.
And we're the generation, to me, we're kind of the first generation to start that more progressive viewpoint of how we view the world and how we view other people. I'm sure we're kind of in the middle. Like I grew, obviously our parents' generation is very different, but like our generation to me was the first to really be more. I mean, we were the first generation to fully listen to hip hop and rap and that, we're just different in that way where it wasn't a big deal. Like when I was younger, I mean, we all listened to that kind, it wasn't this generation now, like you said, any intolerance at all is not accepted. And I think that in my nephews talk about a lot. I mean, I always ask them, like, when it comes to racism, for example, they don't put up with that kind of stuff. I mean, they don't, a lot of those kids nowadays, like, they just don't put up with it. So, and like you said, people who are made fun of or bullied possibly. And like when I was younger, I was both the person who was made fun of, bullied, and I was sometimes the bully. And I look
Yeah.
back now, like you, Rich, and I look back and I feel so shitty. And I was never terrible, of course, but just some of the things I might have either not stepped in on, like you were saying, or just said something stupid here and there. I look back and I feel so awful. And like, 25 years ago, whenever I'm looking at it. And now I realize that happens because we're young and we're stupid. We don't, your brain's not fully developed yet. You're still learning.
Yeah.
So I try to make some excuses for it, but at the same time, it's a beautiful thing to watch the younger generation to, hey, if this kid has autism or if this kid has this, or if it's a race thing, whatever it might be, that you can't tolerate hate. You can't tolerate the nonsense that might've been tolerated years ago. and they're not. And I think that's a great thing. So yes, as scary as they might be in some ways, they with all their auto tone, there's also a lot of great things about this generation, and I have a lot of faith in them that they will eventually make good decisions for not just this country but this world. So that's I don't have anything bad to say. But I know a lot of people bash that generation, but I love them, and I think they're going to do good things.
I do too. I think, and I think what we were talking about, like the 9/11 stuff, like for example, the generalizations faced by like the Muslim population after that, or like anyone who looked like remotely, it could be somebody who was Pakistani, like, they could be Indian, like regardless, people, they would get lumped in, you know what I mean? Like unfairly, because people were that clueless that if you looked anywhere remotely like that, the word terrorist was thrown around, which that would never happen today. Like, I mean, I'm not saying never, because there's a percentage of people that are just still doing whatever it is they're doing. But like with that generation, like that would be nowhere nearly as commonplace as it was for us, and I think that's pretty cool. I do want them to, I asked a few things of them. I want them to know that if they want to argue with me about basketball, I want to see how they fare with their phone down, without the phone in the hand.
Yes, yes.
And to understand that a 90-second Google is not does not make you a Rhodes Scholar on a given topic. You got to go. I think our generation having to go track down books and to like spend more time. We tended to have like, some of my friends with sports are like, oh, you don't admit when you're wrong, and like blah blah blah. I'm like, no, like I'm just consider myself pretty well informed. If somebody gets me, I'll admit it. But I think some of you guys look at a 30-second highlight and think you're ready to come to the table, and you're not. Respectfully, you're not. Like, put the phone down and let's see how it goes then. But like, I want more of that. But in a way, like they're like, we'll see more of this over time. But it's like cyborgish. It's like the phone is like part of their like,
it's true.
Their function. Why would I spend this much time when I could just spend 10 seconds here? And then I don't know, man. They might be right. I might be wrong. The jury is out on that.
No, I'm with you 100% on that. And I have a few more questions for you. I don't want to take up too much of your time, but I want to quickly ask you about Dope Perspective years ago in 2011. Like when you kind of broke into the industry, like what was it like and how long did it take you to get to that point? How much effort did it take and how many years did it take?
Shoot, I started in 2002 or 2003 with the freestyling, probably 2002. So almost a decade. Cause yeah, that was like the first like real coherent piece of work. And that was I used to be in this rap group that people described us as like a Wu-Tang and Beastie type, like hybrid. Like we all had different styles, but we were also like crazy drunk party white boys. And it was like iron sharpens iron though, like, cause we were all good. But like for our shows, we would do this one place would always have us, and we would do 3 sets. And the first set was like new stuff. And the second set was like kind of like our all-star stuff, like our best stuff. And then the third set was old stuff. And the reason why is because we would get progressively drunker. And at the end, it was like, if this just goes totally off the fucking rails, who cares? And so we were like, people liked to see us, but they were also attracted to the train wreck nature of like what could happen. But everyone was really dope at the same time. So like I made that album with somebody from that group, my guy C Nature. And we were both like kind of coming into our own as MCs, and probably at that time had the highest output of work in the group. So we, did that project together, and it was really cool. And it was the most cohesive original work I'd done at that time. And things kind of continued to go from there. But I would say it wasn't until about 2016, I was like, okay, this is getting tough to juggle. I'd moved to Baltimore. And it was getting tough to juggle, and I was doing some stuff in the scene, and I had the chance to do Warped Tour summer 2018. And I was like, people told me it's never going to feel comfortable when you jump. So you just got to do it. And I did at that point. And since then it's kind of continued to elevate, but I'm still scrapping every day. It's been 5 years since I've gotten a paycheck. Right. But I don't feel like I've ever gotten fully used to it. You're still eating what you kill and swimming all the time. So when I couldn't afford a publicist, I became my own publicist. Now that's something we were talking about, the marketing. That's kind of a side hustle for me. art on this project. We need it in a pinch. My partner and I know how to do serviceable art. We're not graphic designers, but we can do some solid stuff. Little things like that, that have changed and have evolved. And whereas some of my peers, respectfully, they may have, I'm not with this, right? You could either swim with the current or go against the current. You know what I mean? And like, there's a way to swim with it and stay true to yourself. So I think that's been the kind of the key thing for me. But yeah, it took a long time, still happening, honestly. But the ageism isn't as much of a thing with rap. It's like if you're doing stuff that's dope and that's you never know when, or you could have your own following of like grown man hip hop, which is kind of what I feel like I make at this point.
And if you had any advice to give to young people coming up in the hip hop industry or want to make it, at maybe 16, 17, 18, what would you tell them?
I kind of would go back to that, like being good is like step one. And recognizing that like you have to do probably 3 or 4 parts the other work for every one part of the actual fun stuff. That doesn't mean not to do the fun stuff. That doesn't mean this career is not for you, but it's like get comfortable getting your hands dirty, get comfortable like doing things outside of music that have to be part of your overall plan. And like for every dollar you spend on a feature to get your favorite rapper, you should be spending on marketing the song. Cause like you spend your whole budget on features and then you can't, you're empty when it comes out, nobody's going to hear it. Like, you have to think about those kind of things, and also like properly vet who's around you. Like be okay having the uncomfortable conversation of like, this is too competitive of a thing to like advance with someone who doesn't have your best interest, or to someone who doesn't compliment you. Like if people don't compliment you or your vision and it's not working, like run with those who do and vet them properly. Like think about it, listen to yourself, like your consciousness, and like, and work smart, work smart with the people you're with. You can't do it alone, and you got to get your hands dirty to kind of crack it all down.
That's some great advice right there. I asked this question to everybody, last question. I can't wait to hear the answer. When you look back at your career, life and career, 30, 40 years from now, what do you want people to know about the legacy of MC Bravado?
That I really care about the people and the art, and have a reverence for that, the culture. And yeah, that would really be it. This is everything to me.
I love it. I love it. Yeah, it's authenticity, man. That's what it's all about in life. Definitely realize that. And anybody listening, when you're out there trying to start a business or whatever you're trying to do, a side hustle, to me, like you were saying, hard work's one thing, but having the right people around you is so important. And I've learned that the hard way throughout my life. You really have to run with the right people, and it's got to be people who you have to jive with, and people who have your best interest at heart. And it's hard to find people like that, because a lot of people are looking out for them. And, we all got to look out for ourselves, but not in, there's a certain way to do that. So I think you have to really, you're with people who are around you who really have your best interest as well as theirs. It's a whole different ballgame.
It is, man. And sometimes it's painful, because like that might be somebody you've known for 20 years, but like the reality is the person you've known for 2 years, who you click with, who you work with every day, probably knows this version of you better.
Yeah.
And true. That's hard. That's hard for people, because you have history. You you might be loyal to a fault at points, and being loyal is good, but that doesn't. You don't have to go down with that ship. If it ain't working for you, like you don't owe somebody that. In business or in the arts, like you can love somebody from a distance. And I think there are a lot of good people that end up not getting where they want to go because of that.
So true. That is so true. Well, Rich, I can't thank you enough for coming on and sharing your story and chopping it up about some 90s NBA. And I could talk for hours about all this stuff. So especially hip hop and the NBA. So I appreciate you coming on, and it was an honor having you on the show, and I hope you come back again sometime.
Thank you so much. This was like, I love the page, and I just love what you do. And I had a great time and a great conversation. Obviously it got a lot deeper than basketball, and was incredible. So like, I'm rooting for you. I'll be watching, I'll be listening, and I'm definitely down to do a round 2 at some point, man. Thank you so much.
Man. Absolutely. Thank you, Rich. I appreciate it.
All right. Have a good night.
You too, man. Okay.